There's a place is not for sale. Not today. Not ever. And the next time you walk through that door uninvited, better pray those men behind you are faster than the ones who'll come for you. She said it quietly. No screaming. No shaking hands. Just a 72-year-old woman in a faded leather jacket, powerful man dead in the eyes and meaning every single word. Holloway laughed. He shouldn't have. If this story moves you, hit subscribe and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this one travels. Let's go. The morning Grant Holloway walked into Eleanor Whitmore's repair shop, he had already decided how the conversation was going to end. He had rehearsed it the way powerful men rehearse things, not because they're nervous, but because they enjoy it. He knew what he was going to say. He knew how she was going to react. He knew exactly how long it would take before the old woman crumbled on the papers and disappeared from his plans like every other obstacle he'd quietly removed from Silver Creek, Montana over the past 2 years. He had done it to Frank Donnelly, who owned 60 acres of farmland west of town. He had done it to Rosa Medina, who ran the only grocery store on the south end. He had done it to the Calloway brothers, who operated a lumber yard their grandfather had built from nothing. Every single one of them had eventually folded, because that's what people do when someone like Grant Holloway turns the pressure up high enough. They fold. They take whatever lowball number he offers, shake his hand, sign the paper, and drive away trying to convince themselves they had a choice. Grant had learned a long time ago that most people will endure extraordinary amounts of injustice if they truly believe that no one is coming to help them. That belief was his greatest weapon. And on that cool Tuesday morning in early October, it was absolutely certain that Eleanor Whitmore was no different from anyone else. He was wrong, but he wouldn't know that yet. Silver Creek was the kind of small Montana mountain town that people outside of Montana have never heard of, and people inside Montana either love fiercely or leave the moment they turn 18. It sat tucked between two ridgelines, population just under 4,000, a place where the diner on Main Street had been open since 1962, and the owner still remembered what you ordered the last time you came in. It was cold 8 months out of the year. The roads buckled and heaved with every winter freeze, and nobody fixed them fast enough. I had 43 kids in the graduating class, and half of them were gone by July. People stayed. They always stayed, because Silver Creek had something that money couldn't manufacture, and developers couldn't replicate. It had history. It had roots. It had the particular kind of community memory that only comes from generations of people building something together in a hard place. Eleanor Whitmore had been part of that memory for most of her adult life, where she had arrived in Silver Creek 38 years ago with her husband, Thomas, 2 suitcases, $1,400 in cash, and a determination that was so quiet it took people years to recognize it for what it was. Thomas had spotted the empty building on the edge of Route 12 and said, "Hesitation, that's the one." Eleanor had looked at the broken windows and the overgrown parking lot and agreed, hesitation, because she trusted him completely, and because she had the same instinct he did that something useful could be made from something broken. Whitmore's repair, and it became exactly what Thomas had imagined, a place where people brought things that mattered to them. Generators, old equipment that had belonged to their fathers, things that carried memory inside their machinery. Thomas was extraordinary with his hands. Eleanor handled everything else: the books, the suppliers, the difficult customers, the late payments, licensing, the taxes, the 1,000 invisible tasks that make a small business survive. In Silver Creek liked Thomas immediately. He was big and warm and funny, and he had this laugh that sounded like gravel rolling around inside a barrel. He coached youth baseball for 6 years. He organized the town's annual 4th of July cookout for 12 years straight. The kind of man whose death, when it came quietly, attack on a January morning, when the temperature was 11 below, left a hole in Silver Creek that people could actually feel. Eleanor had buried him, kept the shop running, and never asked anyone for anything. It had been 9 years ago. Now she was 72, Her blonde hair cut short and practical. Hands that had fixed more machines than most mechanics half her age. A faded leather jacket she'd owned for decades that she wore almost every day, regardless of weather. She drove a truck that was older than some of her neighbors' marriages. She opened the shop at 7:30 every morning and closed at 5:30 every evening. And in between, she did the work with an economy of motion and a quiet competence that people who paid attention found quietly extraordinary. Most people in Silver Creek liked Eleanor. Almost none of them truly knew her. Eleanor Holloway had arrived in Silver Creek 22 months ago with a smile that was too calibrated to be genuine and a business card that listed 4 different titles. But he was depending on the context: property developer, an investment consultant, an infrastructure advisor, a community revitalization specialist. He wore tailored clothes that were slightly too formal for a Montana mountain town. Eleanor had always suspected was intentional, a way of creating distance, of reminding people that he occupied a different economic altitude than they did. The old Peterson Mill property first. Nice was harmless enough on its own. The mill had been closed for 11 years, and the Peterson family had moved to Billings a decade ago. Nobody protested. Nobody organized. The building came down over a weekend in November, and people drove past the empty lot and mostly shrugged. Then he bought the Callaway lumber yard. That was when people started paying attention, because the Callaway brothers hadn't wanted to sell. They had said so, loudly and clearly at a town hall meeting in February. They had explained that the business was profitable, that they employed 7 people, and that they had no intention of going anywhere. 3 months later, they signed the papers and were gone. Nobody in Silver Creek knew exactly what Grant had said to them. The Holloway brothers wouldn't discuss it, but their youngest, Derek, had run into Eleanor at the grocery store 2 weeks before they signed. He'd looked like a man who hadn't slept in weeks. Eleanor had asked him. Derek had looked at her. Then he'd looked around the store and said, then he'd looked back at her and said, quietly, Eleanor, just sell him whatever he wants. Got it? Please. Then he'd walked away. Eleanor had thought about that for a long time. First approached Eleanor about the repair shop in March. Him alone that first time, which she would later recognize as a deliberate choice, a way of seeming reasonable, unthreatening, collegial. He walked in during a slow afternoon around the shop with an expression of polite assessment, and introduced himself as if she might not know who he was. Knew exactly who he was. Ms. Whitmore, he'd said, extending his hand, Grant Holloway. I've been spending some time in Silver Creek, working on some development projects. I've heard a lot of wonderful things about this shop. Eleanor had shaken his hand because she was not rude. Sir, what can I do for you? I'd actually like to talk about what I can do for you, he'd said, with a smile that had clearly worked on many people before her. And looking at this parcel of land, and I think the location has extraordinary potential to discuss making you an offer that could set you up very comfortably for the rest of your life. Eleanor had looked at him for a moment. Shop isn't for sale, she said. I understand that's your current feeling, Grant said pleasantly. I'd love to at least, Mr. Holloway, Eleanor said. Shop isn't for sale, not at any price. Is there something I can fix for you today? Grant had smiled. He'd said he'd be in touch. He'd left. Eleanor watched him drive away and felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Not fear, something older than fear, recognition. She'd seen men like Grant Holloway before. In Silver Creek had always been too small and too poor to attract a certain kind of predator. She'd seen them in other places during other chapters of her life. Chapters she had not opened in years. She recognized the smile, recognized the calibrated pleasantness. She recognized the absolute certainty behind his eyes that everything was simply a matter of finding the right pressure point. Went back to work. She fixed a generator that belonged to Bill Harmon, who ran a cattle operation 12 miles east of town. Closed up at 5:30. She drove home. She did not call anyone yet. Grant came back in April. This time he brought a man named Dennis, who was large and expressionless, and whose function appeared to be decorative, a way of making a room feel smaller. The offer had increased considerably from whatever invisible number had been in his head in March. He presented it with the air of someone being extremely generous. "But this is a serious offer, Ms. Whitmore," he said. "More than fair for this property in this market." "I'm sure it is," Eleanor said. "This answer is still no. You're not even going to consider it?" "I considered it in March," Eleanor said. "But the answer was no in March. It's no now." Grant leaned against the counter, not aggressively, with a casual ownership of space that was designed to communicate something. "There's Ms. Whitmore, I'm going to be honest with you. The development I'm planning for this area is going to move forward regardless. Properties around this location are going to change significantly. This shop, as it exists now, is going to find itself in a very different context. I'd like you to have the opportunity to benefit from that rather than be left behind by it." Eleanor set down the wrench she'd been holding and looked at him. "Are you threatening me, Mr. Holloway?" "I'm informing you," he said. There's a difference." Eleanor picked the wrench back up. "I think we're done for today." Dennis shifted his weight. Grant smiled and said they'd be in touch. After they left, Eleanor stood very still for about 30 seconds. Warner's. Then she went to the old metal filing cabinet in the back office, in the bottom drawer, and took out a small notebook. At her desk and wrote down everything Grant had said, her date and time, and a description of the two men. I put the notebook back in the drawer and returned to work. She had learned a long time ago that documentation was a form of power. The first step in fighting someone who operates in shadows is to bring everything into the light, quickly, patiently, one recorded detail at a time. She had learned that from people most of Silver Creek would never have imagined she knew. By June, the nature of Grant's campaign had shifted. He was no longer coming to see Eleanor himself. Instead, things started happening around the shop. A permit application she'd filed with the county was mysteriously delayed for 8 weeks. Her business liability insurance company sent her a letter citing routine reassessments and raised her premiums by 40%. A rumor began circulating. In town, nobody could identify exactly where it started that the repair shop had been cited for environmental violations. But it hadn't been. Eleanor had a spotless record with the county environmental office. She confirmed with 3 phone calls. On the same afternoon, the rumor reached her. She then wrote a 2-paragraph letter to the county, put it in the mail, and went back to work. But she watched. She watched how the rumor spread. She watched which people repeated it without questioning it, and which people asked questions. She watched Grant's car drive slowly past the shop twice in the same week without stopping. She watched the way certain longtime customers started coming in less frequently, but sheepishly, with the apologetic energy of people who have been told something they half believe and half don't. Old Bill Harmon came in one morning in late June with his generator again. It was a persistent problem. That generator, the kind of recurring mechanical argument that Eleanor had come to think of almost fondly, and he sat in the shop's one plastic chair while she worked, the way he sometimes did, and after 20 minutes of comfortable silence, he said, "You doing all right?" "Fine," she said. "Grant Holloway's been talking to people," Bill said. "Saying things about this place. I know that too." Bill was quiet for a moment. He was 77 and had been a fixture of Silver Creek his entire life. His family had run cattle in this valley for 4 generations. There had been buried here. His wife was buried here. He was going to be buried here. And there was something in his voice, a careful, an urgency that Eleanor recognized as the sound of a person working up to saying something they didn't want to say. "Not of friends," Bill said finally. "Powerful ones. The assessor, 2 of the planning board members, somebody in the state land office, people are saying." "People are probably right," Eleanor said. "Eleanor." Bill's voice dropped. "Maybe you don't," Eleanor said. Harshly, just firmly. "Don't say it, Bill." "Belonged to Thomas," Eleanor said. "He built it. His hands are in every corner of this building. I can feel him here every single day. No man with a briefcase and a bad smile is going to take that from me." Bill looked at the floor, said slowly, "I know," he said, "I know that." He cleared his throat. "Look, I don't want to see you get hurt." Eleanor paused her work and looked at him. Really looked at him. at his weather-beaten face and his worried eyes and the way he was gripping the arms of the plastic chair with hands that had worked hard every day of his adult life. "Oh," she said gently. "Has anyone ever told you I was good at taking care of myself?" He looked at her, shifted in his expressions, not quite understanding, at the edge of something. "I suppose I never thought much about it," he said. "Oh," Eleanor said, and went back to work. Most people don't. The first truly frightening thing happened on a Wednesday night in August. Eleanor arrived at the shop on Thursday morning to find the front window cracked, not shattered, cracked, with a single fracture line running from the lower left corner to the center. Something had hit it with exactly enough force to send a message without quite crossing into a prosecutable act. She stood on the sidewalk and looked at it for a long time. She went inside. Coffee, her insurance company, called the non-emergency police line and filed a report with a deputy named Carson, who was young and earnest and clearly uncomfortable. "Any idea who might have done this?" Carson asked. "I have a very specific idea," Eleanor said, "but I can't prove it. There can you. So let's focus on documenting this as thoroughly as possible." Carson blinked. "Yes, ma'am." He filed the report. He took photographs. He seemed to want to say something reassuring, but apparently couldn't locate the right words. Eleanor walked him to the door when he was done and thanked him for coming. After he left, she sat at her desk in the back office for a moment. She opened the bottom drawer. She took out the notebook. She wrote down the date, time, the nature of the damage, the deputy's name and badge number, and the report number he'd given her. Then she took out her phone and looked at it, not at any message, at any number. She just held it. She sat with the thought that she hadn't allowed herself to sit with, yet the thought that this was escalating in the direction she recognized. The direction where documentation wasn't enough. The direction where quiet patience and institutional channels eventually ran out of room. She had been here before. Not in Silver Creek, not in this life, in a different life. A life she'd left behind decades ago when she and Thomas had made a mutual decision to disappear into normalcy, small-town Montana, into the beautiful ordinary rhythm of a business and a marriage and a community. Put the phone back in her pocket. She went back to work. She fixed 3 chainsaws, a pressure washer, and Bill Harmon's generator again. Something had changed. Something behind her eyes had gone very quiet and very focused in a way that had nothing to do with machinery. Pepper brought the worst of it. Stopped being subtle. He appeared at the Silver Creek Town Council meeting and presented a development proposal that, if approved, would rezone the strip of Route 12 where Eleanor's shop sat from commercial historic to mixed-use development. Architects, he had renderings, he had a spokesperson from the county planning office, one of the same planning board members Bill Harmon had mentioned, sitting in the front row nodding at everything he said. Eleanor sat in the back of the room and listened. Several townspeople asked questions. Grant answered them smoothly, pivoting every concern into an opportunity. Tax revenue, infrastructure improvements. He was good. He had clearly done this many times before. The council chair, a man named Gerald Pruitt, who had been on the council for 12 years and who Eleanor had always found more interested in own comfort than in anyone else's, Grant for the presentation and said the council would take it under advisement. After the meeting in the parking lot, Grant approached Eleanor. "Whitmore," he said pleasantly. "Good to see you. The presentation gave you a better sense of the bigger picture here." "I have a very clear sense of the picture," Eleanor said. "I think you'll find this development is going to happen, regardless of any individual decision," Grant said. "The question is really just whether you want to be part of it or in the way of it." Eleanor looked at him steadily. "Those sound like the same thing to me, Mr. Holloway." Grant's pleasant expression didn't change. I think behind it did a tightening, a fraction of a degree. "I'm trying to be reasonable here," he said. "I've been more than patient." "You've been patient," Eleanor said. "Because you think I'm a problem you can eventually wear down." "I'm not. I'm a problem you created for yourself." For just a moment, one moment, something moved across Grant's face that was not pleasantness or calculation or confidence. A flash of something colder. Then the smile came back. "Take care of yourself, Miss Whitmore," he said. and walked to his car. Eleanor watched him go. She drove home. She sat in Thomas's chair in the living room, the big armchair by the window where he used to read on Sunday mornings, and she looked at the wall across from her where his photograph hung. Thomas at 43, grinning, with a mountain behind him in his arm, around a version of Eleanor who looked younger and fiercer and completely unafraid. She sat with him for a while. Then she said out loud, to the empty room, "I think it's getting close, Bear." She got up. I bed. She slept the deep, uncomplicated sleep of someone who has made a decision. October arrived, and with it, everything changed. It was a Tuesday. Eleanor had been at the shop until 6 a little later than usual, finishing a job on a snowblower that someone needed ready before the first serious weather hit. Up, driven home, eaten dinner, and was sitting at the kitchen table reading when her phone rang. Rosa Medina, Eleanor. Rosa's voice was thin and tight. Into the store today. Grant. She stopped. Eleanor could hear her breathing. He told me the property lease I have isn't valid. A clause in the original building ownership transfer that voids my tenancy if the property changes hands. Eleanor, I've been in that building for 11 years. Livelihood, Rosa. Take a breath. Rosa took a breath. Tell me exactly what he said. Word for word if you can, Rosa told her. Eleanor listened, asked 3 precise clarifying questions, everything down in the notebook she'd brought to the kitchen table without consciously deciding to. A copy of your lease? Eleanor asked. There? Yes. And the original property transfer documents? I think so. Sure. Find them tonight. Don't talk to anyone else about this yet. Don't sign anything. Can you do that? Yes. Rosa's voice was steadier now. Eleanor, what is he doing? Why is He's doing what people like him do, Eleanor said. He's looking for whoever's going to be easiest to break first. He's testing everyone's edges. She paused. He's not going to find yours. Rosa was quiet for a moment. I'm scared, she said. I know, Eleanor said. That's reasonable. Being scared is not the same as being beaten. She paused again. Do you trust me? Yes, of course. Then find those documents at your doors and let me think tonight. She hung up. So she sat at the kitchen table with the notebook in front of her and the pen in her hand. She looked at what she'd written, not just tonight's entry, but the 7 months of entries before it. Every visit, every rumor, every permit delay, every cracked window, oblique threat dressed up as friendly advice. Turned back to the beginning and read the whole thing through. Then she closed the notebook. Then she sat for a very long time. This was quiet. Outside, the wind had picked up the way it does in October in Montana, high and cold and purposeful. She could hear Thomas's wind chimes on the back porch, the ones he'd made from old hardware, from nuts and bolts and pieces of pipe years ago. They rang in an irregular, particular way that she had never been able to describe to anyone, but that she had loved since the first time she heard them. She sat and listened to the wind chimes, and then she stood up from the table. She went to the bedroom closet. She reached past the hanging clothes to the back, where a flat storage box sat on the shelf. Put it down and set it on the bed. She opened it. Inside, beneath a layer of tissue paper that had yellowed with age, were things she had not looked at in many years. A photograph, dozens of people in leather, on a summer day somewhere, grinning at the camera with the particular energy of people who had chosen their family rather than been assigned one. A piece of paper, handwritten, that she didn't open. A silver pin shaped like an eagle, and an old phone, not the kind with a touchscreen, older model, a durable thing built for a specific purpose that she had kept charged out of a habit she'd never quite been able to break. You keep a first aid kit current, even in the years when you don't expect to need it. Hold the old phone in both hands. She didn't turn it on yet. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the photograph instead. Those faces. At the ones she recognized and the ones who were already gone and the ones who had been young and were now old. She thought about what Thomas would say. She knew. She thought he'd probably say, you waited long enough. You gave the normal way every chance it was owed. Now do what you know how to do. She turned the phone on. It worked. It still worked. She pressed the single button that connected to a number she had never needed to delete because she had never once believed, no matter how many years passed, that a time would not come when she might need it. Or twice. A voice answered deep, a little gravel rough, alert, in the particular way of someone who stays alert even when they sleep. Us. Just that word. Just her title. Spoken the way people speak titles that mean something not as a formality but as a recognition. She said, I need you to know something is happening. Not yet, but I'm telling you I might. A pause. Tell me when. We'll be ready. I know, Eleanor said. Sure. I know you will. She hung up. She put the phone on the nightstand next to Thomas's photograph. She turned off the light. She lay in the dark and listened to the wind chimes. And she waited. She didn't have to wait long. 3 days later, her Aunt Holloway walked into Whitmore's repair for what would turn out to be the last time. But he did not come alone. There were 4 of them: Grant, Dennis, the large expressionless man who had accompanied him in April, others who positioned themselves near the door with a casualness that was carefully constructed to feel like a wall, and walked to the counter where Eleanor was wiping down a carburetor. Didn't bother with pleasantness this time. I want to make this simple, he said. I'm done being patient. You've had 7 months and 3 formal offers and a lot of goodwill that you've done nothing but waste. A development timeline, and you're the last piece. So here's where we are. Eleanor set down the carburetor and the rag. Here's where we are, Grant said. My attorney has reviewed the county rezoning application, and we expect approval within 60 days. Once that happens, this building will be assessed under the new designation, which means your current operational permits will need to be reapplied for under a completely different regulatory framework. Of people in that process. You understand what I'm telling you? I understand exactly what you're telling me, Eleanor said. Understand that the path of least resistance here is to take the offer. I'll tell you has gone up again because I respect persistence even when it's pointless. He named a number. It was a larger number than the ones before. It was, by any objective measure, more than the property was worth on the current market. Eleanor looked at him. No, she said. Something shifted in the room. Others moved, slightly, just a weight transfer. Nothing more. Eleanor tracked it with peripheral vision. Miss Eleanor? Grant said, and his voice had dropped into a register that was meant to communicate the end of negotiation. And to be direct with you now, I don't think you fully appreciate your situation. You're 72 years old. You are alone. You have no family in this county. Your business has been losing revenue for 3 months, a fact that was true and that he had clearly engineered. And the infrastructure of this town is about to change in ways that are going to make this location untenable for the kind of operation you run. I am offering you a dignified exit. Take it. Silence. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was completely level. You said something, she said. I want to address it directly. You said I'm alone. You are alone, Grant said. Adams, that's the second time you've made that assumption, Eleanor said. The first time I told you that people who are truly alone don't need to announce it. Others. Do you remember? I remember you thought that was clever, Grant said. It wasn't clever, Eleanor said. It was information. I gave it to you freely, and you chose not to receive it. Grant leaned forward across the counter, closing the space between them, a dominance gesture, a physical punctuation mark. Sign the papers, he said quietly. I promise you, by the time I'm done with the regulatory process in this county, this building won't be worth the land it's sitting on. And you'll sell it for nothing to someone else, and you won't even have the dignity of having made a decent deal. Eleanor didn't step back. She looked at him from a distance of perhaps 2 feet, and she felt very clearly, very specifically, the exact sensation she'd been waiting to feel before she made the call. The sensation of having done everything reasonable, having documented everything documentable, of having given every institutional process every chance it deserved, of having been patient past the point where patience was a virtue and into the territory where it would become complicity. I want to show you something, Eleanor said. She reached under the counter and brought out the notebook, turned it on the counter between them, and opened it to the first page. Well, this is 7 months of documentation, she said. Please visit every offer, every rumor that started in this town after you arrived, permits that were delayed, the insurance rate change, and board members who I've noted as appearing at your presentations. I filed in August about the front window. She turned a page. Rosa Medina's account of the conversation you had with her last week, which she provided me in writing. She turned another page. Donnelly reached out to me 2 weeks ago. He was ready to talk. She turned another page. Holloway is also ready to talk. He's been ready for a while. He was just waiting to see if anyone else was going to go first. Grant stared at the notebook. There's a record, Eleanor said. A complete one. Copies exist in 3 locations. My attorney has a copy. The journalist I know in Billings has a copy. And a federal contact I haven't spoken to in a while, but who I called last week has a copy. The room had gone very still. Eleanor said, you told me I was alone. I want to show you what alone actually looks like. She reached into her jacket pocket, pulled out the old phone. She pressed one button. Twice, the voice answered. Boss, it said. Well, Eleanor said. It's time. She hung up. Grant stared at her. His face had changed in a way she hadn't seen on it before the calculation was still there, working frantically, but there was something underneath it now. There's something she recognized as the beginning of doubt. There's, he asked. Eleanor tucked the phone back into her jacket. She looked at Grant Holloway and said something she'd been waiting to say for 7 months. I'm into my shop, she said, and you told me I was alone. You told me nobody was coming. You told me the best I could hope for was a dignified. She closed the notebook. I want you to stay right here. Don't go anywhere. I want you to watch what happens when the woman you underestimated makes one phone call. Grant opened his mouth, closed it again. Outside, somewhere distant, so distant, it was barely a sound, a vibration. Something was beginning. Eleanor turned and walked to the back office. She sat down in Thomas's chair. She folded her hands in her lap. I waited. Later, much later, when people in Silver Creek talked about what happened next, they would describe it as something started as a feeling before it was a sound. Pressure in the air, a tremor in the windows, something that made dogs lift their heads and children go quiet and grown adults step out of their houses and look down the road without quite knowing why. Then the sound came, not one engine, not 10, not 50. There were hundreds of motorcycles entering a town of 4,000 people at once is a sound that does not leave you. Numbers, it lives somewhere between the chest and the stomach, and it resonates at a frequency that the body understands before the mind has a chance to process it. A violent sound, it is something older and heavier than violence. It is the sound of consequence. Grant Holloway stood in the repair shop and heard it coming. And in the 30 seconds before the first riders appeared on Route 12, every assumption he had made about Eleanor Whitmore rearranged itself inside him with an almost audible shift, like a structure that has been built on a bad foundation, finally acknowledging the ground beneath it. He looked at the back office where Eleanor sat with her hands folded. "How are you?" he asked. His voice had lost something. Celebration was gone. Eleanor looked up at him. "I'm just an old woman," she said. The windows of the shop rattled. The sound grew, and Grant Holloway, for the first time since he'd arrived in Silver Creek, had absolutely nothing to say. The sound hit the building before the bikes were visible. Grant Holloway felt it in his chest first, that low, pulling vibration that has no single source, because it is coming from everywhere at once. He turned toward the window. Then he turned back to Eleanor. Then he turned toward the window again, and in that small, helpless rotation was everything. The complete collapse of a man who had spent 2 years building a world where he controlled every variable, and who was only now understanding that he had missed one. A very significant one. Dennis, the large, expressionless man who had stood near the door through every encounter, with the quiet solidity of furniture, no longer expressionless. He had placed one hand on the doorframe and was looking down Route 12 with the specific look of a person recalculating something fundamental. The 2 men near the door were looking at each other. Nobody was looking at Eleanor. She sat in the back office, in Thomas's chair, with her hands folded in her lap, and her eyes open and her breathing even. And if you had walked in off the street and seen her, she was resting. You would have thought she was resting. You would not have thought she was the reason the windows were trembling. Grant turned from the window. His voice, when it came, had shed the last of its professional smoothness. What was underneath wasn't quite panic, not yet, but it was the raw material of it. "What did you do?" he said. Eleanor looked at him. "On the phone call." "Who did you call?" "I told you," Eleanor said. "Now listen, who are those people?" Eleanor stood up from the chair. She moved at her own pace, not slowly, exactly, but with the complete absence of hurry that belongs to people who have nothing to prove about their own composure. To the doorway, between the back office and the main shop, and stood there, took one involuntary step backward, which he would probably not have admitted to anyone later. "Those people," Eleanor said, "are men who were lost when I found them. Had nothing and nobody. Men who slept on floors and worked for nothing and made bad decisions and worse ones, and had every reason to believe the world had written them off." She looked at Grant steadily. "Write them off. That doesn't answer." "I'm answering," Eleanor said. "I'm answering completely. I just want you to understand the full picture before you see what's outside." The sound was enormous now. The building away, water fills a room from every direction, through every crack until there was no space left that it wasn't occupying. And then gradually it began to change, to resolve into distinct engines, distinct rhythms. As the bike slowed, turned off Route 12 and came to rest. I-1. Then dozens at a time the engines cut, and the silence that followed was somehow louder than the sound had been. Grant moved to the window. He looked out. He stood there for a long moment without speaking. Whatever he saw rearranged his face into something that Eleanor had not seen on him before. She had seen him pleasant. She had seen him pressuring. She had seen him cold. She had not seen him genuinely still. He stopped. "Yes," Eleanor said. "Must be 300 more," Eleanor said. Walked past him to the front door of the shop and opened it and stepped outside. Was cold and dry and smelled like October, and was low, and throwing long shadows down Route 12, and in those shadows stood more men than Silver Creek had seen, assembled in one place in living memory. On bikes, and beside bikes, and leaning against bikes, and they wore leather and patches and the particular stillness of people who are very accustomed to being looked at and have long since stopped caring about it. Not be moved toward the shop. Nobody shouted. Nobody made a gesture that could be called threatening. They simply stood there, and their standing there said everything. Eleanor stood in the doorway and looked out at them. She felt something move through her, not nostalgia, exactly, and not pride, exactly. Something older and quieter than both. Something that lives in the part of a person that knows who they are, regardless of what the years have added or taken away. Then a figure separated from the group. He was in his mid-60s, cropped gray hair, and a face that had lived a full life in visible, permanent ways. He walked toward the shop with the particular gait of someone who is completely comfortable, taking up space, not aggressive, or grounded, like a man whose center of gravity is settled somewhere deep and permanent. Stopped about 10 feet from Eleanor. He took off his sunglasses. He looked at her for a moment with an expression that almost too much to look at directly. Then he lowered his head. "Boss," said Michael Hawk Reynolds. The word landed on Silver Creek like a stone into still water, and the ripples went everywhere. People had come outside. They had. You cannot have 300 motorcycles stop in the middle of a small Montana town without every person within earshot stepping out to see what is happening. On porches and sidewalks, and standing in the parking lot of the Golden Eagle Cafe across the street. They were watching with the wide, careful attention of people who understand they are witnessing something significant, but haven't yet determined whether it is dangerous. That single word, boss. Spoken by a man who was clearly not accustomed to saying it to just anyone. Spoken with a weight that the word doesn't normally carry. Spoken while he dropped his head, not in submission, but in something more complicated. in the particular acknowledgement of a person who is recognizing, like, a debt that cannot be fully named. Rosa Medina was standing in the doorway of her grocery store across the street. There, she had come out when she heard the engines the way everyone had. Vegetables had duct tape on the corners, and she had been watching with her arms crossed and her jaw tight because she had spent the last week in a state of low-grade terror about her lease and her livelihood and the conversation with Grant that had left. Her feeling like the floor had dissolved beneath her. And she had watched Eleanor step outside, and she had watched the big man with the gray hair walk forward and lower his head. And she felt something shift in her chest that she couldn't immediately name. It took her a moment. Then she realized what it was. It was the specific sensation of a story turning. The moment in a long, binding, terrible chapter when the narrative suddenly reveals that you have been misreading the situation, that the person you thought was losing was not losing at all. A patience you misread as helplessness was something else entirely. About every week for the past 7 months, when she had felt frightened and alone and had looked at Eleanor Whitmore and thought, with genuine sadness, she doesn't understand what she's up against. She laughed suddenly, involuntarily, a short sound, with relief. Her employee, a 24-year-old named Jamie, appeared behind her shoulder. "What's happening?" Jamie asked. "I have no idea," Rosa said. "But it's going to be okay." "How do you know?" Rosa watched Eleanor walk down from the doorway to meet Michael Reynolds face to face. She watched the way Eleanor moved unhurried, direct, with the settled authority of someone who has never once needed anyone to clear a room for her entrance. "I've been watching that woman for 3 years," Rosa said, "and I have never once seen her frightened, and I never understood why until right now." Inside the shop, Grant Holloway was doing what calculating men do when the calculation stops working. He was running alternatives. He was standing at the window and watching the crowd outside, and his mind was moving fast, away the emotions that threatened to interfere and looking for the rational path. Always a rational path. There was always leverage somewhere, always an angle. He had lawyers, good ones, the county planning board. He had the assessor. He had 2 years of carefully built relationships with people in positions to make other people's lives difficult. All of that was still true. He told himself that. He repeated it in the order that made the most logical sense. The rezoning application was real and valid. The regulatory process he described to Eleanor was a real process. Motorcycles in a parking lot didn't change county zoning law. It was theater. That was all this was. And yet, the number of people he could count through the window was growing rather than shrinking. Because the riders were not alone. Silver Creek residents were coming out too, by the sound and the sight and the instinct that something worth watching was happening. They're standing apart from the riders. They were standing among them, tentatively at first, and then less tentatively, talking in low voices. And several of the riders were responding, and the separation that Grant would have banked on the separation between a small Montana town and a motorcycle club, the wariness and the distance was not materializing the way logic said it should. As Grant said, Dennis appeared at his shoulder. "Get my attorney on the phone." Dennis took out his phone and dialed. "Goes to voicemail," he said. "Try the office number." Dennis tried the office number. "Saturday," he said. Grant had lost track of the day of the week. That surprised him. He almost never lost track of the day of the week. He prided himself on that. He prided himself on a great many things that, standing at this window, felt suddenly flimsy. "All right," Grant said. He straightened his jacket. He made a decision, the decision that a certain kind of man always makes when confronted with circumstances he cannot control, just to walk directly into them and brazen it through on personality and authority and the sheer nerve of refusing to look uncertain. It had worked before. It had worked many times before. He was very good at it. He walked to the front door of the shop and opened it and stepped outside. It shifted when Grant emerged. Dramatically, nobody surged forward. Nobody shouted. The quality of the attention changed. People who had been looking at Eleanor or at the assembled riders turned and looked at Grant. The quality of their attention was not what he was accustomed to. He was accustomed to being looked at with deference, slightly cautious regard that people reserve for those with visible money and institutional access. He was accustomed to being the most important person in any room he entered. What he walked into now was not that. Eleanor turned when she heard the door. So did Michael Reynolds. Reynolds looked at Grant with an expression that contained approximately nothing, not hostility, contempt, just the complete absence of any recognition that Grant was significant. That absence was more uncomfortable than any open hostility would have been. Grant walked toward Eleanor with his hands at his sides and his chin up. Whitmore, he said, I don't know what you think this accomplishes. Then let me explain it, Eleanor said. This is a legal matter. He glanced at Michael and the assembled crowd. Whatever statement you think you're making here, it doesn't change the regulatory process. It doesn't change the zoning application. It doesn't change anything, I said inside. You're right that it doesn't change the regulatory process, Eleanor said. But it changes something else. What? It changes who's watching, Eleanor said. Frown. What does that mean? It means, Eleanor said, for 22 months, you've been doing what you do in the way you always do it quietly, individually, one person at a time, making sure that each person feels completely alone before you apply pressure. A very effective method. It works because people who are frightened and isolated make poor decisions. She looked at the crowd. It only works if people stay isolated. She raised her voice not dramatically, but with theatrical effect, but simply louder, the way a person who is accustomed to being heard projects when they need everyone in a space to receive something. She said. Rosa Medina stepped forward from across the street. She was still holding her arms crossed, but her jaw was set now rather than tight, and the expression on her face was the look of someone who has decided that they are done being afraid of something. This told me my lease was invalid, Rosa said clearly. Of two witnesses. He said there was a clause that voided my tenancy when the property changed hands. I've had a lawyer look at my lease in the last 2 days. She looked directly at Grant. There is no such clause. He made it up. A murmur went through the assembled people. Opened his mouth. Rosa wasn't finished. I've had that store for 11 years, Rosa said. I employ 4 people. I have never missed a rent payment. And this man told me to my face that I had no legal right to be there because he wanted to frighten me. Her voice held steady. For about a week, I was terrified. And then Eleanor called me, and she said something I want to say out loud right now. She paused. She said being scared is not the same as being beaten. The murmur grew. Eleanor turned back to Grant. His expression had shifted again. The brazenness was still there, barely, but it was visibly costing him something to maintain it. Donnelly, Eleanor said, from somewhere in the crowd, and it took Grant a moment to locate him. Frank Donnelly had aged considerably from stress in the past year and was standing near the back. Frank stepped forward. A rancher in his late 50s with a farmer's posture and a farmer's hands and the careful, measured speech of a man who doesn't use more words than a situation requires. Told me the environmental compliance on my land was going to be referred to the state agency, Frank said. Told me there were irregularities in my water usage permits going back 15 years. The fine exposure alone could bankrupt me. A pause. There were no irregularities. I've had 2 different compliance attorneys look at my records since then. He invented a liability that doesn't exist to make me believe I had no choice but to sell. He stopped. With great deliberateness, I want my land back. Grant turned toward him. That sale was illegal. That sale was made under fraudulent pretense, Eleanor said, which is a phrase your attorney will know very well. A beat of silence. Something happened that nobody had planned or orchestrated. Eric Calloway stepped out of the crowd. He was in his late 30s, and he had the look of someone who has been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and has just decided to set it down regardless of the consequences. Looked at his shoes for a moment. Then he looked at Grant. The county was going to condemn the lumberyard, Derek said. There was a structural inspection report that was going to require a full closure. Thus, we had 60 days before the county would shut us down, and at that point we'd lose the property anyway and get nothing. His voice was not quite steady. There was no inspection report. I know that now. I knew it then, He stopped, swallowed. I was so frightened I couldn't think straight. He made me feel like we'd already lost, and the only question was whether we'd walk away with something or nothing. He looked at his hands. Grandfather built that yard, Derek said. My father ran it for 30 years. We were going to run it for another 30. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. Michael Reynolds, who had been standing slightly behind Eleanor through all of this, now stepped forward to stand beside her. He said nothing, simply stood there, and the fact of his presence and the presence of every person behind him was a sentence that needed no words. He looked at the faces around him, at Rosa, at Frank, at Derek, at the Silver Creek residents who had come out of their houses and were now standing not as a fearful, isolated collection of individuals, but as something that had consolidated, had found its gravity. He looked at Eleanor. For the first time in 22 months, he had nothing to say. It was Bill Harmon who broke the silence, and nobody had expected it to be Bill, because Bill was not a man who broke silences. He was a man who occupied them. But he walked forward from somewhere near the edge of the crowd, with his 77-year-old body moving slowly and his 77-year-old eyes very clear, and he stopped a few feet from Grant, and he said in a voice that carried perfectly, I've lived in this valley my entire life. My father lived here. Grandfather was one of the men who built the first road into this county. He let that settle. I have watched you work for 2 years. I have watched you take things from people who built them. I have watched this town get quieter and quieter because frightened people go quiet. He turned and looked at Eleanor. I have stood in that woman's shop and looked her in the eye and told her not in so many words, but I told her to give up. His jaw tightened. I've been ashamed of that since the day I said it. I'm going to be ashamed of it for the rest of my life. He turned back to Grant. I'm not going to be quiet anymore. And I'm going to tell you something that I think you may not have understood when you came to this town. We are a small place. We don't have much, but we know each other. We know our history. And there is not a single person standing on this road right now who will allow you to do to the next person what you've already done to the last one. He stepped back. It was completely still. And then someone started clapping. At first, then faster. And then it wasn't just clapping, but voices agreement, recognition, the specific sound of a community that has rediscovered its own collective nerve. Leonard Holloway stood in the middle of all of it and felt something he had not felt since he was very young and very without resources, uncertain of his own survival. He felt small, not because anyone was threatening him, not because anything physical was happening. He felt small because he was surrounded by people who were not afraid of him. That had never happened before. He looked at Eleanor one last time. She was looking back at him with the expression he'd found inexplicable since the beginning, the one that was not anger and not triumph and not contempt. He understood it now. Standing in the middle of this crowd, with the late afternoon, light low, and the air cold and the weight of 300 pairs of eyes somewhere behind him. It was patience. That was all it had ever been. The patience of a person who knew from the very beginning how this was going to end, and had simply been willing to wait the situation out until everyone else caught up. Copies of the documentation go to the State Attorney General's office Monday morning, Eleanor said. Already spoken to a contact there. If you want to have a conversation with your attorney before then, I'd suggest doing it tonight. Grant said nothing. Welcome to stay in Silver Creek, Eleanor said, not to do what you've been doing. She turned and walked back toward the shop. Earl fell into step beside her without being asked. The way people do when they've spent enough time with someone to know their rhythm. Walked up to the door, and Eleanor stopped and looked at him. He was looking at her with that same expression from before, the one that was almost too much to look at directly. How long has it been? Eleanor asked. 8 years since I've seen you in person, Michael said. Longer since it mattered. Eleanor made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. I'm a long way. You told me you might call, Michael said simply. The rat, I wasn't going to miss it when you did. Eleanor looked at him. Gray in his hair and the lines in his face and the way he was still after all these years. After everything, the same person she'd first met when he was 23 years old, and sleeping in a van and eating gas station food, and absolutely convinced that no one in the world had any use for him. "Done well," she said. He shook his head. "We've done well. There's no version of what any of us built that doesn't start with you." Eleanor looked away. There Thomas's photograph, just visible through the window of the shop. She looked at it for a moment. "He would have liked today," she said quietly. "To Michael, exactly. To the air. To the general direction of 9 years ago, and the particular permanence of a person who is gone but not absent." Pearl followed her gaze to the photograph. He'd known Thomas. There's he had. He nodded once. "Bear always said you were the toughest person he ever met," Michael said. That to everyone who would listen. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "He said I was stubborn," she said. "He meant it as a compliment, it was." She put her hand on the door. Then she stopped and turned back to look at the crowd behind her. At Silver Creek, assembled in the road, the riders standing among the townspeople, at Rosa and Frank and Derek and old Bill Harmon, all the faces of a community that had spent 2 years shrinking and was now, in this one October afternoon, beginning the long, slow process of expanding back to its actual size. For a long time. "Okay," she said, "in particular, or perhaps to Thomas, or perhaps to the version of herself that had stood in a different place in a different decade and made a different life from the rubble of 100 hard situations." She opened the door and went inside. What happened in the next several weeks moved faster than anyone in Silver Creek had expected, and slower than Eleanor had feared. The state attorney general's office received the documentation on Monday morning. Eleanor had said it would. A contact she'd maintained for nearly 15 years, a woman named Audrey Crane, who had once been a legal advocate for motorcycle accident victims, and who had, over many years of unexpected dinners and stranger phone calls, developed a profound respect for Eleanor Whitmore's particular brand of meticulous, patient record-keeping called Eleanor, back within 2 hours of receiving the package. "Comprehensive," Audrey said, which from Audrey was equivalent to most people saying, "This is extraordinary." Only land sale alone, if what you're documenting about the fabricated environmental liability is accurate. "It's accurate," Eleanor said. "Frank's compliance attorney's written assessment and 2 years of clean agency records. Then that sale was made under fraudulent inducement," Audrey said, "which means it's voidable. And if the Donnelly transaction is fraudulent, methodology applies to the Callaway sale too." "I know," Eleanor said. "Board members, the ones you've connected to his presentations. I have attendance records from 4 public meetings, 3 instances of documented contact between those individuals and Grant's development company, and 1 email that Frank found in a filing he kept from the sale process that references a county facilitation arrangement." Silence on the line. "Eleanor," Audrey said, "how long have you been collecting this?" 7 months, Eleanor said. "He gave me 7 months." Silence. Then, "Oh, Silver Creek. It's going to be fine," Eleanor said. "It's remembering who it is." Grant Holloway did call his attorney that Saturday night, who was extremely good and extremely expensive, and who had been instrumental in several of Grant's previous acquisitions, listened to the situation and said several things in succession that Grant did not enjoy hearing. First was that fabricated regulatory threats as inducement to sell constituted fraud in the state of Montana and carried significant civil and potential criminal exposure. The second was that if multiple transactions had used the same methodology, liability compounded rather than distributed. The third was that the involvement of a state attorney general's contact meant that the window for getting ahead of this had probably already closed. That the remaining question was how far ahead of the narrative Grant could still position himself. "But what does that mean practically?" Grant asked. "It means," his attorney said carefully, "the difference between a civil settlement and a criminal referral is often determined by cooperation and timing. And the timing is already not ideal." Grant was quiet for a long time. "And this," he said. "It wasn't quite a question." "On what you're describing," his attorney said, like she documented everything from the beginning and waited until she had a complete record before doing anything with it, which is actually a very sophisticated approach. She's 72, Grant said. His attorney was quiet for a moment. Then Mr. Holloway, I'd strongly suggest that you stop letting that be a factor in how you evaluate her. Grant stared at the wall of his hotel room for a long time after he hung up, about the way she'd walked back into the shop, looking back at him, without waiting to see his reaction, any of the visible satisfaction that he would have felt and shown in her position. Just that straight back and those unhurried steps and the door closing behind her. About the notebook. 7 months of entries. Her date, every word, every detail. She had been ready for him from the beginning. He had never once been ready for her. He did not sleep well that night. He did not sleep well for many nights after. But that particular night, lying in the dark in a Silver Creek hotel room, while the wind blew cold off the mountains, was the first time he understood completely, all the way down, that he had done something that could not be undone. Not because of the legal exposure, not because of the Attorney General's office, because of 300 motorcycle riders on Route 12, as he had walked into a repair shop on the edge of a small Montana town and looked at a woman and decided, evidence, without investigation, without one moment of genuine assessment, that she was no one. He had been completely wrong. Of being that completely wrong about a person who had spent 7 months preparing perfect, ridiculous response to his every move was going to be expected very high. Meanwhile, in the shop, Eleanor made coffee. Michael had come inside with 3 of his people, and they sat around the old work table, and Eleanor poured coffee from the ancient maker that Thomas had bought in 9,994, and that she had repaired so many times she could do it in the dark. And they sat together in the particular comfortable silence of people who have known each other through enough hard situations to have nothing to prove. When he came, Eleanor asked. 347, said a man named Luis, compact and quiet, and had known Eleanor since he was 19 years old, and she had sat with him in a hospital waiting room for 11 hours after an accident that everyone else had written off as his own fault. He said the number with a matter-of-factness that didn't quite conceal the thing underneath it. 347, Eleanor repeated. Some of them drove 2 days, Michael said. Tucker flew in from Oregon. Got a rental. You know he'll never admit that. Eleanor shook her head slowly. You didn't ask for this many, Michael said. I know. But when the message went out, he stopped. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. Us. You know what you are to these people. You've always known. He searched for the word. You don't account for it. Never have. I only did what needed doing, Eleanor said. You did it when nobody else was doing it, Louise said. Not the same thing. Huh? Eleanor looked at them, these men who were no longer young, whose faces carried the permanent record of hard miles and harder years, and who were sitting in her dead husband's repair shop on a Saturday afternoon in October because she had pressed one button on a phone she'd kept charged for 40 years. She felt the weight of that, not as a burden as the thing it actually was, as the accumulated evidence that a life spent doing the right thing in unremarkable moments, consistent expectation, accounting, needing recognition, eventually amounts to something that cannot be manufactured and cannot be purchased and cannot be taken away by any man with a briefcase and a bad smile. Thank you, she said. It was quiet, insufficient. Any word available. Michael looked at her. Don't thank us, he said. This is just us paying a debt that doesn't have a bottom. Outside, through the window, the sun had finished setting over Silver Creek and the streetlights were coming on one by one. The crowd had not entirely dispersed because people were talking, really talking, the way communities talk when something has cracked them open and reminded them that they belong to each other. Frank Donnelly was talking to Derek Calloway, and they were both talking to a man in a leather vest who was leaning against his bike and listening with the careful attention of someone who understands that other people's stories are important. Medina had gone back to her store and come back with coffee in paper cups that she was distributing to riders who were cold. Marmon was standing with Michael's second-in-command, a man named Torres, and they were looking at the mountains together in the companionable silence of 2 old men who have understood something about weather and time. Eleanor watched all of it through the window. She thought about Thomas, about all the years they had spent building this small, quiet, unglamorous, only real life in this small, old, difficult, profoundly beautiful town. She thought about the choice they had made, whether to close the old chapter and open this one, about whether that choice had been right. Well, she looked at the photograph on the wall. She decided it had been right, completely right, right in every way. And also looking out the window at Silver Creek, coming back to itself in the October dark, she decided that some things from the old chapter had been worth keeping. The knowledge, the patience, the notebook habit, with one number in it, and the promise, the one she had never asked for, Herbert, that had simply been given to her by people who meant it. Ever need us, you call. She had called. They had come. 347 of them. She put down her coffee cup and stood up. "I'll need to eat," she said, in a voice that was completely ordinary and completely hers. The Golden Eagle. "Charlie owes me 3 favors, and he has a parking lot." Michael looked at her. Then he laughed, a sound like gravel in a barrel, like Thomas's laugh, that Eleanor's breath caught for 1 second before she recovered. "There it is," Michael said. "There's boss." Eleanor picked up her phone and dialed Charlie at the Golden Eagle Cafe and told him she had a situation that required his parking lot and probably everything in his kitchen. And Charlie said, without hesitation, "Give me 45 minutes. Charlie had lived in Silver Creek his whole life, and he knew that when Eleanor Whitmore called and said she had a situation, the correct answer was always yes. She hung up and put her coat on, she said to Michael and Louise in the room in general. "Let's go feed people." She walked to the door. She opened it. She stepped out into the cold October night of Silver Creek, Montana, and she walked toward the Golden Eagle Cafe with the same stride she'd always had, unhurried, completely grounded. Behind her, the shop stayed lit. Thomas's wind chimes rang in the dark. Charlie Briggs had owned the Golden Eagle Cafe since 1989, and in all that time he had fed loggers and ranchers and highway crews and 2 sitting governors and 1 very lost country music star who'd taken a turn off I-90 and ended up staying 3 days. He had fed the town through blizzards and drought years and the slow economic grinding that had taken pieces out of Silver Creek, the way wind takes pieces out of rock gradually, invisibly, until you look up one day and realize the shape of the thing has changed. He had never fed 347 members of a motorcycle club on 45 minutes notice. But he'd said yes to Eleanor because Eleanor had asked, and because Charlie Briggs was the kind of man who understood that some requests were not really requests at all, but rather a community calling itself back together. The correct response to that kind of call was to put on an apron and start cooking. Eleanor walked through the door of the Golden Eagle with Michael Reynolds at her shoulder and Luis behind him, and a slow river of riders following them into the parking lot. He had every burner going and had called his 2 part-time staff back in and had left a message for his supplier that he was going to need a delivery first thing Sunday morning and that it was not negotiable. "Eleanor," he said, from behind the counter, in hand, "how many eggs do you think we have?" "Not enough," Eleanor said. "We'll manage." "That's what you always say. It's always been true." Charlie pointed the spatula at Michael. "Who's this?" "Michael Reynolds," Eleanor said. "He's a friend." Charlie looked at Michael. He looked at Charlie. Charlie looked back at Eleanor. "You have interesting friends," he said. "I've been told," Eleanor said. Moved past him toward the back to see what they were working with. That was how the evening began. Not with ceremony, but with speeches, with eggs and coffee, and a woman who knew how to turn 45 minutes of warning into something that fed 400 people. Eleanor had always been better at the practical architecture of care than anyone gave her credit for, because she had learned decades ago that feeding people was one of the oldest and most reliable ways to remind them that they mattered. Golden Eagle filled up completely and then overflowed into the parking lot, and the riders in the Silver Creek residence stood together in the October cold, eating whatever Charlie and Eleanor could put together. Conversations happened that would not have happened in any other configuration of this night. Donnelly stood with a man named Barker, who had ridden 14 hours from Oregon because a message had gone out, and he had not hesitated. He told Barker about his land, and Barker listened the way people listen when they recognize a story they've heard before in different words. Heather gave Jamie from the store the night off and stayed herself, moving between tables, talking to people, laughing at something a writer named Torres said that made her coffee come out her nose. It made Torres inordinately proud. Derek Calloway sat in the corner booth for a long time, quietly, with his hands around a mug of coffee, until Louise sat down across from him without asking and said simply, "About it?" Derek looked at him. "Sir, you don't even know me. I know you lost something that belonged to your family," Louise said. "Enough to sit for." Derek looked at his coffee. "I keep thinking if I'd been stronger, if I hadn't believed him so fast. There's trusted me to handle it, and he made you believe there was no floor," Louise said. "That's what men like that do. They don't beat you with force. They convince you the ground is gone. And when someone convinces you that there's nothing to stand on, oh, that's not weakness. That's physics." Derek was quiet for a moment. "Like that happened to you?" Luis turned his coffee cup. "I was 19, he said. "I was in a hospital after an accident. One who was supposed to be there wasn't. Everyone told me it was my fault. I believed them." He paused. "Then an old woman sat down in the chair next to me and stayed for 11 hours and didn't say much and didn't need to." Derek looked across the cafe to where Eleanor was standing at the counter talking to Charlie, in the completely unself-conscious way of someone who has no idea or refuses to account for the room she commands. "I know that for you," Derek said. "She did it for a lot of us," Louise said. "Ours. And now you're going to do something for yourself. Come to stand up and tell the truth about what happened to your family. It's to be on record, and it's going to matter." Derek Calloway nodded slowly. Something in his posture changed, not dramatically, but measurably. The particular shift of a person putting down a weight they've decided to stop carrying alone. That was the Golden Eagle that Saturday night. 100 small versions of that same shift, all happening simultaneously, in the compressed, pressurized atmosphere of a community that had rediscovered its own collective backbone. Eleanor moved through it all and didn't miss anything. What happened Monday morning arrived faster than Grant Holloway's attorney had predicted and harder than Grant had hoped. The Attorney General's office did not merely receive Eleanor's documentation. They had apparently been receiving complaints about Grant Holloway's acquisition methods in 2 other Montana counties for the better part of a year. Complaints that had individually been too thin to act on, isolated, too difficult to pattern match without a central piece of evidence tying the methodology together. Eleanor's notebook was that piece. Audrey Crane called Eleanor at 8:45 Monday morning. Eleanor was already in the shop, already working, a rebuilt carburetor sitting finished on the bench. The only transaction is going to be referred for fraud investigation, Audrey said, preamble, because she and Eleanor had been communicating in precise, ornamented language for 15 years. So is the Calloway sale. Those significant interest in the planning board contacts you documented. 2 of the names you mentioned appear in connection with a separate land acquisition in Flathead County that's been on someone's radar for 8 months. Eleanor set down her tool. The timeline for a formal investigation could be months, could be longer. But Grant's ability to continue operating in Silver Creek is going to be severely limited starting today because his attorney filed a voluntary disclosure this morning. A pause. Disclosure, Eleanor said. His attorney did on his behalf, which means he's trying to get ahead of it. Audrey's voice carried the very slight, very controlled inflection of someone who finds something satisfying but is too professional to say so outright. He's claiming the regulatory threats were overstated in translation and that he had no fraudulent intent in the Donnelly or Calloway transactions. Of course he is, Eleanor said. Voluntary disclosure doesn't resolve anything, Audrey said. It tells you something. It tells me he's scared, Eleanor said. It tells you his attorney is very good at reading which way the current is moving, Audrey said. Which amounts to the same thing. Eleanor looked at Thomas's photograph, quiet for a moment, Audrey, she said, Frank Donnelly wants his land back. The Holloway family wants their lumberyard back. Is that realistic? In a fraud case where the inducement is documented and the documentation is as thorough as what you've given me, Audrey said. Yes, it's realistic. It won't be fast. But yes, Eleanor breathed out slowly through her nose. Oh, she said. Thank you. Don't thank me, Audrey said. Handed me a case fully assembled. I just have to walk it through the door. After she hung up, her corner sat very still for about 30 seconds. Then she put the phone in her pocket and looked at the carburetor on the bench. She picked up her tool and went back to work. She would tell Frank today. Well, she would tell Derek today. She would let them carry the news themselves as it belonged to them. She told Frank first, because Frank was the one who had stayed quietest in the parking lot, whose statement had carried the most weight and cost him the most to deliver. She drove out to his property that afternoon, as Frank Donnelly did not go places easily anymore. The stress of the past year had settled into his joints and his back in ways that were visible, and she sat at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee he poured with hands that still shook. And she told him clearly and completely what Audrey had said. Frank listened without interrupting. He was not a man who interrupted. Eleanor finished. He sat with it for a long moment. Realistic, he repeated. Her word, Eleanor said. Audrey doesn't say realistic unless she means it. Frank looked at the window. Outside, his land ran to the tree line, and then the mountain rose behind it. The same view his father had looked at and his grandfather before that. He had been staring at that view for the past year with the specific grief of a person who believes they are seeing something for the last time. Eleanor, he said. His voice was rough. I signed the paper. I took the money. Even if the sale gets voided, even if I get the land back. He stopped. How do I live with having let that happen? Eleanor looked at him steadily. Frank, he fabricated a liability and convinced you your only option was to sell. Not you letting something happen. That's someone doing something to you. I should have fought harder. You didn't have the tools, Eleanor said. Well, now you do. The question is what you do with them going forward that you couldn't do before you had them. Frank was quiet. Cup. My father would have fought, he said. There never faced someone who came in with lawyers and fabricated county documents, Eleanor said. Harshly. Your father faced drought and bad cattle prices and hard winters. He knew that terrain. You were navigating something you'd never encountered in unfamiliar country. She paused. The fact that you stood up Saturday and said it out loud in front of everyone that took more courage than staying quiet. Frank. Don't minimize that. Frank looked at the table. His jaw worked. He was the kind of man whose emotions lived close to the surface, but who had spent 60 years learning to keep them there, banked and controlled, not because he was ashamed of them, but because the land demanded steadiness, and he had given it steadiness his whole life. My land back, he said, very quietly. I know, Eleanor said. Trying to get it back. She meant it. The certainty in her voice was not performance. It was the same quality that had made Michael Reynolds drive to Silver Creek without question, the same quality that had made Rosa Medina step forward in the parking lot, some quality that had kept that shop on Route 12 open for 9 years after Thomas died. It was the certainty of a person who has done enough hard things successfully to know the difference between a problem that cannot be solved and a problem that simply has not been solved yet. Frank looked at her. Something in his face let go, not completely, all at once, but the particular tightening around his eyes that had been there since January, eased by a degree that was visible. How did you help us, he asked. Me and Rosa and Derek. You didn't have to get involved in our situations. Add your own. Eleanor considered this. Thomas used to say something, she said finally. He said the most dangerous thing a community can do is watch its people get picked off one at a time and tell itself each one is an individual problem. She looked at the window. Grant's method only works if people stay separate. The moment they stop being separate, the whole structure collapses. So getting involved in your situation wasn't separate from protecting my own. It was the same thing. Frank nodded slowly. Smart, he said. Experience, Eleanor said. She went to see Derek Calloway that same evening. Derek's response was different from Frank's. in the way that a man in his late 30s is different from a man in his late 50s, with more volatility, more visible anger, the emotions less banked and more immediate. When Eleanor told him what Audrey had said, Derek stood up from the kitchen table and walked to the window and stood there with his back to her for a moment, and his shoulders were doing something complicated. "This lumber yard," he said. "The sale is being reviewed as fraudulent," Eleanor said. "Realistic chance of being voided." Derek turned around. His eyes were wet, which he clearly had complicated feelings about, because he blinked twice fast and looked at the ceiling for a second before looking back at her. "Their brothers need to know this." "Yes," Eleanor said. And he stopped. "After I signed. After I told them it was the only way. They said it was okay. They said they understood." He stopped again. He put his hand on the back of the chair. "I have been living with what I saw on their faces the day I told them it was done. Every single day." Eleanor said nothing. She let him have the moment. "Let me get it back," Derek said. "I don't know if I can explain to them." "You don't have to explain it," Eleanor said. "Call them. You just have to call them." He looked at her. "Call your brothers right now," Eleanor said. "Right. Tell them exactly what you told me in the parking lot Saturday. Tell them you were frightened, and he made you believe there was no other option, and you've been carrying that since the day you signed. And then tell them what Audrey said." She paused. "Let them respond to the true version of events instead of the one you've been protecting them from." Derek stared at her. "How do you know they'll—" "I don't," Eleanor said. "That the story you've been telling yourself about how they see you is being written entirely in your own head without their input. Give them the chance to tell you something different." A long silence. Pulled out his phone. He set it on the table. Looked at it. Then he looked at Eleanor. "Would you—" He started. "Would you mind staying while I call?" Eleanor sat down across from him. "I'll take your time," she said. Derek picked up the phone. He dialed. When his oldest brother answered, Derek's voice cracked on the first syllable, and he stopped, and he breathed, and then he started talking the real version, complete version, the one he'd been carrying alone for nearly a year. And Eleanor sat across the table and kept her eyes on the window and gave him the particular kind of presence that doesn't intrude but doesn't abandon. It was what she'd always done. It was, in the end, that 347 people had driven to Silver Creek to honor. But by the second week of November, the investigation was formally open. The county planning board members Eleanor had documented were placed on administrative leave pending review. Holloway's development application was suspended by the county planning office, citing procedural irregularities, language that meant, in practice, that someone in that office had read the voluntary disclosure document and made a calculation about which way the current was moving. The same calculation Grant's attorney had made, now spreading like water, finding its level through every institutional crack in Silver Creek's local government. Gerald Pruitt, the town council chair, who had received Grant's development presentation with such comfortable accommodation, resigned from the council on a Thursday afternoon. Citing personal reasons, he issued no further statement. His resignation letter was 6 sentences long and contained the word personal 4 times, which anyone in Silver Creek could have told you meant something other than personal. Holloway left Silver Creek quietly on a Wednesday morning, packed and Dennis driving. He did not stop at the shop. He did not say goodbye to anyone. He drove north out of town on Route 12 and was gone by 7 in the morning. And the first person who confirmed it was the owner of the motel where he'd been staying, called Rosa Medina, because Rosa was the most connected person on the south end of town, and Ross told Rosa, who told Eleanor, who nodded once and went back to the engine she was rebuilding. She had expected it. Men like Grant Holloway do not stay to watch the accounting. They leave before it arrives and let their attorney speak in their place. And they go somewhere else, and they begin again, or they don't, but either way they are not there to see the faces of the people they hurt looking at them while the truth is spoken out loud. Eleanor thought about that for a moment, about the particular kind of cowardice required to build an entire operational method around other people's isolation, and then isolation was broken, to simply remove yourself from proximity to the consequences. Then she put it aside. It wasn't hers to carry. That nobody in Silver Creek had anticipated the one that arrived on a cold November afternoon and rearranged the story. One more time came in the form of a phone call to Eleanor from Audrey Crane, 17 days after the investigation opened. There's something in the disclosure documents, Audrey said. Didn't expect, and you need to know. Eleanor put down her tool. Tell me. Grant Holloway was not operating alone, Audrey said. Voluntary disclosure references a development partnership, 3 individuals. Grant was the visible face. The other 2 are a pause that Eleanor recognized as Audrey choosing her words, significantly more resource than Grant. Regional developers. One of them has land acquisition projects in 4 states. They used Grant as the front contact specifically because he was the one willing to have direct conversations with property owners. Eleanor was very still. Planning board contacts, Audrey continued. The county assessor relationship. The state land office connection you mentioned. Those didn't come from Grant. They came from the partnership. Grant's partners had built those relationships over years. Multiple counties waiting for the right development opportunity. Silver Creek was bigger than Grant, Eleanor said. Grant Creek was a test case, Audrey said. Acquisition worked. If Grant could deliver the Route 12 corridor, the partners were prepared to bring in a development package that would have restructured the entire commercial profile of the county, talking about something that would have made Silver Creek unrecognizable in 10 years. Eleanor looked at Thomas's photograph. Documentation you provided, Audrey said, gives us not just Grant, but the structure he was working within. Not a local fraud case anymore, Eleanor. This is a pattern of conduct case across multiple counties and potentially multiple states. The weight of that settled in the room. Well, he already hurt here, Eleanor said. Frank, always. Rosa's lease situation. Everything that was done in Silver Creek is part of the broader case now, Audrey said. It actually strengthens the individual remedies. It wasn't Grant improvising. It was a methodology being applied from above. Documented, it's systematic, and it's going to be very difficult to defend. Eleanor sat with that. I'm going to ask you something, she said. Go ahead. The partners, Eleanor said. Are they still operating in other places right now? Other towns like Silver Creek? A pause. That's being actively looked at, Audrey said carefully. If they are, Eleanor said, then the notebook and the documentation aren't just about Silver Creek. Every town where somebody is being told they're alone and nobody is coming. Audrey was quiet for a moment. That's correct, she said. And that framing is exactly how the case is going to need to be built. Then build it that way, Eleanor said. Whatever you need from me, however long it takes. After she hung up, Eleanor sat in the shop for a long time. The light shifted as the afternoon moved. The wind chimes rang. She was thinking about other towns, their repair shops, other farmers, other Rosa Medinas who had believed a week or a month or a year that they were completely alone. She was thinking about what it costs a community to lose itself, quietly, their time, by person, business by business, until the thing that made the place real is gone. And what's left is a shell that used to hold something alive. She was thinking about Thomas, who had looked at a broken building on Route 12 and said, that's the one, and had meant not just the building but the town. The whole complicated, resilient, real thing. The people who stayed when others left. The roots that went deep enough to survive hard seasons. A particular kind of community memory that takes generations to build and can be hollowed out the inside by someone who knows how to weaponize isolation. This time, she thought. She picked up the phone. Michael, I have something to tell you, she said when he answered. And then I have something to ask, Michael said. About the partnership, about the other counties, the scope of what Audrey had described. She spoke precisely and completely, the way she always did, without editorializing, letting the facts carry the weight they actually had. When she finished, Michael was quiet for a moment. What do you need? He said. I need to know if we have people in those other counties, Eleanor said. Not to confront anyone, not to do anything outside the law. I need to know if we have eyes and ears in places where this same pattern might be playing out. And I need to know if any of those people know how to document. Another pause. Us, Michael said slowly. Are you building a network? Eleanor considered the word. Already inside one, she said. I'm just considering using it for something it was always capable of. Let me make some calls, Michael said. You might say that, Eleanor said. She hung up. She picked up her tool. She went back to work on the engine. It was a 1987 model, reluctant and complicated, the kind that required patience and precision, and the particular knowledge of a machine's personality that only comes from having spent enough time with it to understand how it thinks. Eleanor understood how it thought. She always did. Of Silver Creek, in the weeks that followed, moved through something that had no clean name, but that people in the community understood as a kind of reckoning, not the dramatic, ceremonial kind that ends in a single scene, but the slow, kind that happens in offices and phone calls and conversations at kitchen tables, and that is mostly invisible to anyone watching from outside, but is felt completely by everyone living through it. The planning board was reconstituted. 3 new members were appointed in a special session. One of them was Rosa Medina, who had never sought public position in her life, but who accepted the appointment because Eleanor had said, one morning, someone has to sit at that table who knows what it cost to not have anyone there. It might as well be someone who learned that firsthand. Rosa had said she didn't know anything about planning board procedure. Eleanor had said she'd learn. She always did. Bill Harmon drove out to the Callaway lumber yard one afternoon and walked the property with Derek. They walked much. They didn't talk much. They were both men who expressed important things through presence rather than language. The whole perimeter, Bill had stood at the corner of the main building and looked at the mountain and said, "There, your grandfather was a good man. I went to school with him." Derek had looked at him. "I didn't know that," he said. "I know a lot of things about this county that aren't written down," Bill said. "People should know them before they're gone." Derek had looked at him for a moment. "Will you come and talk to us sometime?" "Me and my brother? We'd like to hear them." Bill had said yes, simply and immediately, as if it was the easiest decision he'd ever made. In some ways it was. Mountain Eagle Cafe stayed open late most nights now, as people had remembered how to gather. Charlie had not consciously changed his hours. It had happened organically. The way things happen in small towns when the social temperature shifts. Someone came in at 8 and stayed. Someone else came in at 8:30. By 9, there were 12 people at tables who would have been home alone a month earlier. They had stopped trying to close on time because there was something happening in his cafe that he didn't want to interrupt, which was his community, remembering it was a community. I called Eleanor one evening and said, "I don't know what you did. Whatever it was, I'm grateful." Eleanor had said, "I didn't do much. People were ready. They just needed to see that one person wasn't going to back down." "That was you," Charlie said. "That was Thomas's shop," Eleanor said. "I was just the one standing in it." Charlie had been quiet for a moment. Then, he would have been proud of you. Eleanor didn't answer right away. Outside the window of her kitchen, the wind chimes were moving in the dark. "I think he would have laughed," she said finally. "Always laughed when I outsmarted someone. He said I made it look too easy, and that was the most intimidating part." Charlie laughed. "That's the most Thomas thing I've ever heard." "Yes," Eleanor said. "It really is." She said good night and hung up the phone and sat in the kitchen for a while with the notebook open in front of her. She wasn't writing in it. She was reading back through it, not the recent entries, the early ones. Their March, their April, a quiet accumulating documentation of a person who had understood from the beginning that the situations was require patience and evidence, and the complete refusal to be frightened into movement before the moment was right. 7 months of entries, 1 phone call, 347 people, or town remembering who it was, and somewhere in 4 other states, and playing out in other towns with other people who believed they were alone, who didn't yet know that a 72-year-old woman in a faded leather jacket and her faded leather notebook and her 1-button phone was already building toward them, without announcement, the way she did everything. Eleanor closed the notebook. She looked at Thomas's photograph on the wall, about the conversation she'd had with Michael, and the calls he was making, and the network that had always existed, and the new use it was being considered for. About the weight of that, the responsibility of it. Or real power, the kind that is given rather than taken, requires constant accounting. She thought about what Thomas would say about all of it. She thought he would say, "You never could leave well enough alone." He would mean it as the highest possible compliment. A notebook back on the table. She stood up, turned off the kitchen light. She walked down the hall. I was at the doorway of the bedroom, the way she sometimes did. I'm at the nightstand, where the old phone sat beside his photograph, charged and present and permanent in their own particular ways. "There, Bear," she said quietly. She went to bed. Outside, Silver Creek settled into its November cold, into the particular silence of a mountain town after a hard season, silence that is not empty, but full of everything that has been endured and survived and held on to, of the particular stubborn life of a place that knows how to close around itself in winter and emerge, still itself. Every spring, the wind chimes rang. Michael Reynolds made 11 phone calls in the 3 days after Eleanor told him about the partnership. There it is. He made them the way he did everything methodically, wasted motion, working through a method that he had maintained for decades, with the particular discipline of a man who understood that the difference between a network and a mob was organization, intention, and the willingness to be accountable for what you set in motion. Chapter leaders in Flathead County and Cascade County, and 2 contacts in Idaho who had been doing quiet community work for years that nobody outside their immediate circles knew about. A woman named Sandra Park in Billings, who ran a tenant advocacy organization and who owed Eleanor a favor from 2019 that Sandra had always said she would pay when the time came. A retired county assessor in Missoula named George Tillman, who had spent 30 years watching development money move through Montana's administrative infrastructure, and who had, for that time, developed a very precise map of where the pressure points were. George Tillman's response, when Michael described what Eleanor had uncovered, a single sentence delivered in the flat, unsurprised voice of a man who has been waiting a long time for a specific piece of news. "I've been watching those 2 names for 6 years," George said. He went very still. "Which 2 names?" George said them. He wrote them down. He called Eleanor immediately. Eleanor was in the shop when her phone rang. There, she set down the alternator she was working on and answered, and Michael gave her the names without preamble, and she wrote them in the notebook without reacting visibly to them. And when he finished, she said, "Send me everything George is willing to share." "He's willing to share everything," Michael said. And I'm quoting directly. He said, "Tell Eleanor Whitmore that if she's found a way to get these people on record, he will personally drive to Silver Creek to shake her hand." Eleanor looked at Thomas's photograph. "George, I'll put coffee on," she said. She called Audrey Crane before she even put the phone down from Michael. Audrey answered on the second ring. Eleanor gave her both names. The silence that followed was the longest pause she had ever heard from Audrey Crane, a woman who paused. "Eleanor," Audrey said finally, "where did you get those names?" "A retired county assessor in Missoula who's been compiling his own documentation for 6 years," Eleanor said. "Operate fully. He has records." Another pause. This time, because Audrey's mind had already moved into the practical architecture of what this meant. "This changes the scope of the case significantly," Audrey said. "No," Eleanor said. We're no longer talking about Silver Creek. We were never only talking about Silver Creek," Eleanor said. "They just needed to make Silver Creek impossible to ignore first." Audrey made a sound that was as close to a laugh as Eleanor had ever heard from her. "The foundation case locally, so the broader investigation would have something solid to anchor to," she said. "That was always the door," Eleanor said. "Not the room, my God," Audrey said quietly. "Back to business. I need to make 3 calls. Can you give me 2 hours? I'll be in the shop," Eleanor said. She put the phone in her pocket and picked up the alternator and went back to work. 2 hours, And 17 minutes later, Audrey called back and said that federal jurisdiction was being considered. Two names Eleanor had provided appeared in connection with a land acquisition fraud investigation that a federal task force had been building in parallel for 14 months. Voluntary disclosure Grant Holloway's attorney had filed in Montana had just become significantly more interesting to people significantly further up the institutional food chain than Audrey's office. How significantly further up? Eleanor asked. Audrey said a name. Eleanor sat down. It was the first time in the entire 7 months, in the entire arc of this situation, that she had sat down involuntarily. Level, she said. That level, Audrey confirmed. Your notebook, Eleanor. Your 7 months is a methodology. They want to talk to you directly. Eleanor looked around the shop. Their tools and the parts and the machines in various states of repair. Thomas's work table. At the photograph on the wall, the window through which, 6 weeks ago, she had watched 347 people arrive on Route 12 because she had pressed one button. Here, she said. Thursday, Audrey said. They'll come to you, to Silver Creek, Eleanor said. To the shop, Audrey said. Specifically, they were very clear about that. Rotters. They said if the documentation was produced in the shop, they wanted to see the shop. After she hung up, Eleanor sat for a full minute without moving. She was doing what she did when a situation required complete assessment, holding all the moving pieces in her mind simultaneously, running the connections, checking the load-bearing points, identifying what was solid and what might shift. It was the same cognitive process she used with complicated machinery, a patient, methodical mapping of a system's internal logic. She had opened a notebook in March to document a local property developer. She was receiving a federal visit on Thursday. The distance between those two things was, enormous. In another direction, the direction of following a thread wherever it actually led, of refusing to accept that a problem was smaller than its evidence, suggested it was perfectly logical. One step at a time, each one following necessarily from the one before. Thomas's voice, in her memory, you never could leave well enough alone. She stood up. She walked to the door. She opened it and stepped outside into the November cold. She stood on the sidewalk of Route 12 and looked at Silver Creek, at the Golden Eagle across the street with its lights on and people visible through the windows, at Frank Donnelly's truck parked in front of the hardware store, at Rosa Medina's grocery sign lit up in the early dark, a particular familiar texture of a town that had come close to losing itself and hadn't. Then she went back inside and called Bill Harmon. Bill, she said when he answered, I need to tell you something, and I need you to not tell anyone else yet. All right, Bill said immediately. She told him all of it. Not because she needed his permission or his advice. Bill Harmon had lived in this valley for 77 years and had sat in her shop and told her to give up, and had then stood in the middle of Route 12 and said one of the most courageous things she'd ever heard a person say in public, and he deserved to know how far the thing he'd been part of had actually reached. When she finished, Bill was quiet for a long time. Federal, he said. Federal, Eleanor said. Because of your notebook. Because of everyone who was willing to tell the truth, Eleanor said. That book just organized it. Another silence. She could hear him breathing, slow and steady the way old men breathe when they're doing serious thinking. Eleanor, he said, I've lived here my whole life. I know this valley the way I know my own hands, and I have to tell you something I should have said to you a long time ago. Bill, no, let me say it. I have watched you for 9 years since Thomas passed. Watched you keep that shop running by yourself, and I watched you be part of this community quietly, ever asking for anything back. And when Grant Holloway came, his voice caught slightly. I sat in your chair and I told you to fold. And you looked at me and you said you could take care of yourself. And I went home and I thought about that for months. I realized I had never once, not in 9 years, actually asked myself who Eleanor Whitmore was. I just knew you as Thomas's widow and the woman who fixed things. Eleanor said nothing. Sorry for that, Bill said. For reducing you to that. Always more than that, and I was too comfortable in my own assumptions to look properly. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Some chimes moved outside. Bill, she said. You sat in that chair, and you tried to protect me the only way you knew how. And then when it mattered, you stood up in the middle of that road and said something that broke something open in this whole town. She paused. I don't need an apology. I need you to know that what you did that Saturday was as important as anything I did. A long silence. Oh, Bill said. His voice was rough. Put coffee on Thursday morning, Eleanor said. I want to come by the shop. George Tillman drove from Missoula on Wednesday evening and arrived in Silver Creek at 9:15. Eleanor knew because he called from the road at 8:45 to say he was an hour out and to ask if the offer of coffee was still standing. But him at the shop. He was 71, hair and a careful professional bearing that had survived 30 years of bureaucratic politics without losing the particular quality of a person who came to work every day knowing the difference between what regulations said and what was actually happening. Looked around the shop, looked at Eleanor, and said, "You kept a notebook." From the first visit, Eleanor said, "Long. 7 months." George Tillman set his briefcase on the counter and looked at her with an expression that mixed professional respect with something more personal, the particular emotion of a person who has spent years working in isolation on a problem and has just discovered that someone else was working on the same problem from a different angle, and that both of their work is now going to mean something. "I have a filing cabinet," he said, "at my house. 6 years of documents. Transaction I could track, every administrative contact that appeared more than once in connection with unusual acquisition activity, every instance where regulatory process seemed to bend in a specific and recurring direction." He opened the briefcase. He set a folder on the counter that was 2 inches thick. "This is the condensed version." Eleanor looked at it, opened it to the first page. She read the first 3 paragraphs. She looked up at George. "Why didn't you take this to the Attorney General's office 6 years ago?" George sat down in the plastic chair, the one Bill Harmon always sat in, and looked at his hands. "I did," he said, "in 2019. I was told the evidence was circumstantial, and that without a documented local transaction showing the specific methodology, pattern alone wasn't actionable." He looked at Eleanor. "A Silver Creek," he said. "A complete, documented local case that showed the methodology in action from the first contact to the conclusion. They needed someone on the ground who was willing to let the situation develop and document it in real time rather than react to it in the moment." He paused. "I spent 6 years hoping someone would be that person. I didn't know it was going to be a woman in a repair shop in a town of 4,000. Eleanor looked at the folder. "What about Silver Creek specifically?" "Before Michael called. I knew about Route 12, George said. I'd seen the development application in the county planning records. I'd seen 2 of the names on the planning board contact list appear in connection with Flathead County activity a year earlier. I was watching, but I didn't have a contact on." He paused. "I was waiting for someone to start documenting." Eleanor was very still. "You knew this was coming," she said slowly. "You knew they were going to make a move in Silver Creek." "I suspected," George said carefully. "The infrastructure was being built, the administrative relationships, regulatory positioning. It looked like pre-acquisition preparation. Suspicion without documentation isn't enough." Eleanor finished. Eleanor looked at Thomas's photograph for a moment. About March. About Grant walking into the shop for the first time with his calibrated smile and his business card with 4 titles. The conversation she'd had that evening, not with Michael or with Audrey, but with herself, sitting at the kitchen table with a blank notebook and a pen, making a decision about how to respond to what she recognized. She had recognized it. She had known what it was immediately because she had seen the shape of it before in other places, other forms, in the long, complicated geography of a life that most people in Silver Creek had never known about. She had recognized it and she had made a choice. Don't react. Document. Wait. Build the case so completely that when the moment came, there would be no gap in the record, no missing piece, angle left unaddressed. She had given them 7 months and they had filled every page. Eleanor said, "You're 6 years in my 7 months." Together, George said, this becomes the most complete documentation of this particular methodology that any investigator has seen. Eleanor nodded once. Then let's make sure Thursday goes well. They worked until 2 in the morning, the work table in the shop, organizing George's 6 years alongside Eleanor's 7 months, building a chronological and structural map of the operation that showed not just what had happened in Silver Creek, but how Silver Creek fit into a pattern that crossed county lines, state administrative systems, and eventually in 2 documented transactions that George had traced with extraordinary patience federal land grant processes. It was meticulous work, detail work, the kind that does not announce itself and has no dramatic moment and is absolutely essential, as evidence that cannot be clearly presented is evidence that cannot be used. Eleanor was very good at it. George, watching her work, at one point, around midnight, "Can I ask you something personal?" "You can ask," Eleanor said, which was not a guarantee of an answer. "How did you know how to do this?" he said. "Not the documentation, specifically the whole approach. But the patience, the deliberate choice not to escalate before the record was complete. Most people, when someone starts threatening their property, their first instinct is to fight back immediately. You held for 7 months. Eleanor was quiet for a moment, her eyes on the papers in front of her. "I've dealt with people who operate through power and intimidation before," she said. "A long time ago, in a different context." She turned a page. "I learned that the worst thing you can do when someone is trying to frighten you is let them see that it's working, because the moment they believe they're winning, they stop being careful. They get comfortable. And when people who operate in shadows get comfortable, they make mistakes." She paused. "Grant made 17 mistakes in 7 months. I wrote all of them down." George looked at her for a long time. "Not standard conflict resolution," he said. Well, Eleanor agreed. "It isn't." He seemed to want to ask more. He decided not to. Some information, in his 30 years of professional experience, offered when the person was ready, and not before. He went back to the papers. They worked until 2. Thursday arrived with a gray sky, and the specific cold of November in Montana that settles in with a permanence that tells you summer is not coming back anytime soon. Eleanor opened the shop at 7:30 the same way she opened it every day, unlocking the door, turning on the lights, starting the coffee maker, because she had decided long ago that the best way to approach any significant day was to begin it with the same actions that began ordinary days. Routine was a form of composure. Composure was a form of power. Bill Harmon was there at 8 o'clock, because of course he was. Sat in the plastic chair and accepted the coffee. Eleanor handed him without comment, and they sat together in comfortable quiet for 20 minutes before he said, "How are you feeling?" "Like I always feel," Eleanor said. "What is that?" She considered it genuinely. "Like there's work to do, and I know how to do it." Bill nodded as if that was the most reasonable answer in the world. "Thomas used to say you were the most unfrightened person he ever met," he said. Thomas was easily impressed, Eleanor said. Bill almost smiled. "Well, he really wasn't," he said. Rosa arrived at 8:30 with a box of pastries from the bakery on Main Street that she'd apparently special ordered the day before, which was a Rosa Medina solution to emotional tension. Bring food, make the room warmer, give people something to do with their hands. She set the box on the counter and hugged Eleanor briefly, Eleanor permitted with the slightly formal grace of a person who accepts affection without being entirely comfortable being the recipient of it. "Okay?" Rosa asked. "I'm good," Eleanor said. "Federal investigators," Rosa said. "Not in the shop. That's the plan." "Are you nervous?" Eleanor looked at her. "I kept a notebook for 7 months specifically so that when this moment came, I would have nothing to be nervous about." Rosa looked at her for a second, then laughed. The real laugh, the one that made her whole face change. "Right," she said. "Right, of course. I keep forgetting who I'm talking to." "Most people do," Eleanor said. "Not a problem." George Tillman arrived at 9, briefcase in hand, looking like he'd slept well and eaten breakfast, Eleanor approved of. Michael Reynolds arrived at 9:15. Eleanor had not expected. She hadn't asked him to come, and she looked at him when he walked in the door and he said, "Claire, I'm not missing this." Eleanor looked at him for a moment. Then she pointed at the back wall. There's coffee. I know where the coffee is, Michael said. Several investigators arrived. At 9:45, two of them, a woman named Agent Carol, who was in her mid-40s and had the specific kind of stillness that comes from years of listening carefully, a man named Agent Webb, who was younger and moved with the careful precision of someone who has trained himself not to miss details. They came in a dark sedan, showed their credentials, shook hands with Eleanor in a way that was professional and measured and that contained, underneath the professionalism, the particular quality of people who have read a file and formed an impression and are now checking that impression against the reality in front of them. They looked at the shop. They looked at George. They looked at Michael and Bill and Rosa with expressions that recalibrated slightly. They looked at Eleanor. Thank you for meeting with us, Miss Agent Carol said. Thank you for coming here, Eleanor said. They sat at the work table. Eleanor set the notebook in front of Agent Carol. Months of entries, organized by date and category, cross-referenced with the supporting documents she had assembled over those months. Underneath it, George's folder, 6 years of documentation, organized in the integrated structure he and Eleanor had built on Wednesday night. Agent Carol opened the notebook to the first page and began reading. She read for 11 minutes without looking up. Eleanor sat across from her and watched and said nothing. When Carol finally looked up, there was something in her expression that was not quite surprise, more like confirmation, like of someone who suspected something was excellent and has just verified it. Documented every interaction, Carol said. From the first day, Eleanor said. Carol turned to a specific page including the exact wording of his threats, regulatory language he used. I wrote it down immediately after each conversation, Eleanor said. The wording was still exact. I've done a lot of repair work. You learn early that you can't fix something accurately if you're working from an approximate description of what's wrong. You need the exact words. Carol looked at her. More. In 14 months of building this case, we have never had documentation from a ground-level source that was this complete. Eleanor said nothing. Board names, Carol said. The administrative contacts. Specific regulatory language used as inducement in both the Donnelly and Callaway transactions. This is going to allow us to demonstrate the methodology directly and connect it to the partnership structure. Agent Webb leaned forward. Can I ask, when you began this documentation in March, did you anticipate it would reach this level? Eleanor thought about that honestly. I anticipated that whatever he was doing was bigger than Silver Creek, she said. Because the infrastructure he was using, the county relationships, regulatory positioning that takes years and resources to build. Don't build that for one acquisition in one small town. I didn't know the specific scope, but I knew there was scope. Webb exchanged a look with Carol. You're not a law enforcement professional, he said. Quite a question. No, Eleanor said. But you approached this like one. Eleanor considered that. Approached it like a mechanic, she said. You read the whole system before you start taking it apart. Because if you don't understand how the pieces fit together, you'll fix the visible problem and miss the one that's actually causing it. A silence. Earl Harmon, from his plastic chair in the corner, made a sound that was somewhere between a cough and a laugh. Covered it with his coffee cup. Carol looked at Eleanor for a long moment. Retired assessor, she said. Mr. Tillman, his documentation and yours together. 6 years and 7 months, Eleanor said, overlapping in 17 specific instances. 17, Carol said. I can walk you through each one, Eleanor said. Carol looked at Webb. Webb nodded once. Please, Carol said. Eleanor opened the integrated document she and George had built on Wednesday night. She walked them through it clearly, precisely. Drama or embellishment, as the facts themselves were the argument, and facts stated plainly are always more persuasive than facts stated with emotion. She explained each of the 17 overlapping instances. She explained the connection between the Silver Creek Planning Board contacts and the Flathead County activity George had documented. She explained the 2 federal land grant processes that appeared in George's 6-year record and that are connected to the Silver Creek methodology documentation suggested a pattern of regulatory capture that went further than the state-level case. For 40 minutes, Agent Carroll took notes on everything. Webb recorded with Eleanor's permission. George answered technical questions about county assessor processes and administrative procedure. Michael sat against the back wall and said nothing, and was, under his presence, a fact about Eleanor that required no explanation. Finished, Carol set down her pen. "I want to tell you something," Carol said. "Normally, person to person." Eleanor nodded. "What you built here," Carol said, gesturing at the documents on the table, "is going to do something that 14 months of institutional investigation couldn't accomplish on its own. To give us the ground-level documented evidence that connects the methodology to the partnership, to the specific harm caused to specific people. Only the Calloway family, Rosa Medina." She paused. "Others who are hurt here have names now in the record, as statistics or property transaction entries, as individuals with documented stories." She looked at Eleanor. "That matters enormously in how a case like this is prosecuted and how a jury understands it." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. About Frank at his kitchen table, wanting his land back. About Derek Calloway calling his brothers. About Rosa Medina stepping off the curb into the parking lot with her arms crossed and her jaw set. "Well, the truth," Eleanor said. "All of them." That made it matter. "I just gave them somewhere to put it." Carol nodded. Closed her folder. She looked at Eleanor with the expression not quite the same as Michael's expression. Not the same as Bill's, but in the same family of expressions that Eleanor had been seeing for 6 weeks on the faces of people who were revising their initial assessment of who she was. "More question," Carol said. "Go ahead." "The motorcycle club," Carol said carefully. 347 riders. On the same day Grant Holloway made his final approach. She paused. "The plan, the timing?" Eleanor looked at her. "Oh, the call when the situation warranted it," Eleanor said. "Timing was Grant's." Carol absorbed that. "He accelerated his timeline and didn't know you were ready." "He assumed I was alone," Eleanor said. "People make that assumption frequently. I've learned to let them along." Pause. "Ms. Whitmore," Carol said, "I'm going to say something I don't typically say in the field." "All right, I'm glad you were here," Carol said. "In Silver Creek, in that shop." She paused. "I'm glad you didn't sell." Eleanor looked at Thomas's photograph on the wall. For a moment. "So, am I?" she said. "The investigators left at 2 in the afternoon. Copies of everything with them." George Tillman drove back to Missoula with the knowledge that 6 years of work had just become the structural backbone of a federal case, and the expression on his face in the parking lot before he drove away was the specific expression of a person whose patience has been retroactively justified, which is one of the rarest and most satisfying experiences a patient person can have. As Michael stayed, he and Eleanor sat in the shop after everyone else had gone. They sometimes did when there was nothing left to accomplish and everything to simply be present with. Afternoon light moved. The coffee went cold. Neither of them rushed to fill the silence. There's who finally actually spoke. "You know they're going to ask you to stay involved," he said. "Oh, the investigation, they're going to want you accessible." "I know," Eleanor said. "Are you going to do it?" Eleanor thought about it honestly, about what staying involved meant. The phone calls, the meetings, the slow grinding institutional process of building a federal case, months or years it would take to move from documentation to accountability. About Frank's land, about the Calloway lumber yard, Rosa on the planning board, learning procedure, sitting at a table that used to exclude her. She thought about the other towns, ones George had tracked, the ones where the same methodology was playing out right now. Today, in the particular silence of people who believe they are completely alone. "There," she said. Michael nodded. He wasn't surprised. "There," said. "There's something I want to ask you," Eleanor said. "Anything?" "The people we might be able to reach," Eleanor said. "They're in those other counties, in other places where this is happening. If someone in one of those places starts documenting the way I did and they need support, they need to know that they're not alone. While they're still in the middle of it, can we build that?" Michael looked at her for a long time. A way for isolated people to know there's a network, he said. They have to make the call. Before they have to make any call, Eleanor said, just knowing it exists changes what you're capable of. Sure. From the beginning, I knew. And it changed how I moved through every single one of those 7 months. If I hadn't known, she paused. I might have folded in April. Michael was very quiet. I never would have folded, he said. I don't know that, Eleanor said simply. Sure. I know that knowing I wasn't alone made it easier to act like I wasn't afraid. Act like you're not afraid. Long enough changes the actual situation. Michael looked at the window. Yes. At Silver Creek beyond it, at the particular late afternoon light of a November day in Montana, cold and gray and very clear, the kind of light that shows you things exactly as they are. There, he said finally. We can build that. Eleanor nodded. She picked up her coffee cup, found it cold, set it back down. She stood up and took the cup to the small sink in the back and rinsed it out with the automatic efficiency of a person who never lets small tasks pile up. Call Frank, she said. He deserves to know how today went. Go call Frank, Michael said. Her phone, she dialed. Frank answered on the second ring, the way he always answered immediately, because Frank Donnelly had spent his whole life attending to things that needed attending to. Frank, Eleanor said, today went well. I need you to know that. A silence. Then Frank's voice, rough with something he wasn't naming. Well enough that I want you to call your attorney tomorrow morning, Eleanor said. Tell him the federal investigation is formally open and that the documentation he'll need is in the record. She paused. And Frank, we're on the right road. That the silence on the other end was long. She could hear Frank breathing. She could hear very faintly through the phone the sound of wind moving across his land. The 60 acres that had belonged to his family for generations. The land that Grant Holloway had taken from him through a fabricated liability and a fear that had been deliberately, carefully manufactured. Eleanor, Frank said. His voice was completely steady. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, Eleanor said. We've got road ahead. I know, Frank said. Thank you anyway. She said goodnight and hung up. Ignore. She stood in the back of the shop with the phone in her hand for a moment. About the road ahead. About the federal case and the months it would take in the other towns and the network that didn't exist yet but would. Rosa on the planning board and Derek calling his brothers and Bill Harmon sitting in the corner of the shop this morning with his coffee, steady and present, showing up the way he should have been showing up all along and doing it now without ceremony because some debts get paid quietly. About Thomas, she thought about what he would say, about all of it, about the notebook, the call, about the 347 people and the federal investigators and the 6 years and 7 months of documentation that had just become the spine of something much larger than Silver Creek. He would say, I told you so. He would be grinning when he said it, gravel in a barrel laugh. She felt it move through her, not grief. Not at this moment. Something warmer. Something that had his voice in it without being sad. She walked back into the main shop. Michael was still there, sitting at the work table, looking at the wall where Thomas's photograph hung. He was something, Michael said. He didn't look away from the photograph. He really was, Eleanor said. He used to say. Michael stopped. Shook his head slightly. What? Eleanor said. Michael looked at her. He used to say that the two of you together were unstoppable because you were the patience and he was the motion. He said alone you were both extraordinary. Together you were something that didn't have a name. Eleanor looked at the photograph. Told you that? She said. Many times, Michael said. He was very proud of you. Always. In the way that people are proud of things they understand the full value of. He paused. I don't think he was wrong. Eleanor looked at Thomas's photograph for a long time. Wasn't wrong about much, she said finally. The shop was quiet. Outside, Silver Creek moved through its late November afternoon. Its people and their businesses and homes, and the Golden Eagle, and the planning board meeting Rosa was preparing for, and the lumber yard where Derek Holloway was walking the property again with his brothers, all three of them, for the first time since the sale, saying things to each other that had needed to be said for a year. The wind chimes rang. Eleanor picked up her jacket from the hook by the door. Come on, she said to Michael. Buy you dinner. You're buying, Michael said. I fixed your carburetor in 2009, Eleanor said. You never paid me. Michael laughed a gravel laugh. Thomas's laugh. The laugh that lived in both of them in different registers. Up. They walked out of the shop into the November dark, Silver Creek, into the particular cold and clarity of a town that had found its way back to itself. Eleanor locked the door behind her without looking back. She knew what was in there. It wasn't going anywhere. Emily Land came back in March. Not quietly, through a bureaucratic letter dropped in a mailbox. It came back on a Tuesday morning when Audrey Crane called Eleanor at 7:43 and said the fraud finding had been upheld and the sale had been formally voided and Frank Donnelly was legally restored to full ownership of his 60 acres effective immediately. Eleanor said thank you, hung up, and called Frank before she even started the coffee maker. Frank answered on the first ring. She told him in 12 words, "The land is yours again. Call your attorney today." The sound Frank made was not a word. It was something that lived below language, in the part of a person that holds things too large for sentences. Eleanor listened to it and said nothing, because some moments don't need company. They just need witness, and she was willing to be that. Frank finally spoke. His voice was rough and direct and completely unashamed. "I'm to go walk it," he said. "Right now, before I do anything else." "Go walk it," Eleanor said. First. He hung up. She stood in her kitchen and looked at Thomas's photograph on the wall, the one she'd moved from his shop to the kitchen months ago, as she wanted him closer during the long evenings when the casework ran late, and she said to him, "Sit down, Bear." The Callaway lumberyard followed 6 weeks later, illegal restoration moving faster than anyone had predicted, because the fraud documentation was so complete that Grant's attorneys had stopped contesting the methodology and shifted entirely to damage mitigation, which was a strategic concession that Audrey said, with the controlled satisfaction she reserved for moments of genuine victory, everything about how they assessed their own position. Derek called Eleanor the evening the news came through. He didn't say much. He said, "We're going back in on Monday." Pause. "Me and both brothers." A pause. "We're going to name one of the buildings after our grandfather." Eleanor said, "He would have liked that, Derek," said Eleanor. "I need you to know something. Tell me. I used to think courage was something you either had or you didn't. It was fixed. Built in." He stopped. "I don't think that anymore. I think it's something you can learn from watching someone else use it." Another pause. "I learned it from watching you." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "Already," she said. "You just needed to see that the ground was still there." She hung up and sat with that for a while. The federal case moved the way federal cases move, with the grinding, critical momentum of an institutional process that is large and slow, and it reaches critical mass, essentially unstoppable. Of Grant Holloway's partners were indicted in May. Development covered 4 states and 11 separate land acquisition transactions spanning 8 years. Tillman's 6 years of documentation and Eleanor's 7 months together formed the evidentiary spine of the case. Prosecuting attorneys described in their brief as the most comprehensive ground-level fraud documentation this office has encountered in a pattern of conduct case. Eleanor read that sentence in a letter from Audrey and didn't say anything about it to anyone. She set the letter in the filing cabinet, the same bottom drawer where the notebook had started, and went back to work on a snowblower that needed a new impeller. What she did tell people, Rosa, Bill, Michael, Frank, anyone who had been part of it, was simpler. She told them, "Everything we built held. That was enough." Medina had been on the Silver Creek Planning Board for 4 months. By the time the indictments came down, she had turned out to be exactly what Eleanor had predicted: someone who learned procedure fast and asked the questions that needed asking, and had, in the particular way of people who have been on the wrong side of an institutional failure, unerring instinct for exactly which processes needed the most careful watching. Arch meeting, she had flagged a development application that had 3 characteristics she recognized from the documents Eleanor had shown her in October She had asked 7 very specific questions that left the applicant unable to answer 2 of them. The application was tabled pending further documentation. Nothing dramatic. No confrontation. Just a woman at a table asking the right questions because she knew what the wrong answers looked like. Eleanor, after that meeting, "I think I understand now," she said, "what you were doing all those months. The questions you asked me, the way you listened, you were teaching me." "I was having a conversation," Eleanor said. "They were teaching me," Rosa said again. "Don't be modest." "I'm never modest," Eleanor said. "All right, I just know the difference between teaching and talking. Learn that yourself." "I just talked." Rosa laughed. "Thomas said that every day for 31 years, Eleanor said. Always sounded happy about it. The morning Michael came to say goodbye, because the riders had stayed longer than anyone expected, some of them quietly integrating into Silver Creek's daily life in ways that had surprised the town and then stopped surprising it. Eleanor was in the shop. There she was. He walked in at 8, his gear packed, like loaded 40-some riders waiting in the parking lot of the Golden Eagle for the signal to move. He stood at the counter and looked at Eleanor, who was working on a vintage engine that belonged to a rancher named Pete Hollis, who had driven 40 miles to have Eleanor specifically work on it. As word had spread in a radius around Silver Creek that Whitmore's repair was the place you brought things that mattered. "Heading out," Michael said. "I know," Eleanor said. There, she set down her tool and wiped her hands. She looked at him. He looked back. There was a long history in the space between them, decades of it, but layered and complicated, and ultimately, underneath all its complexity, accessible to a very simple thing. A woman who had seen something worth saving in people that the world had written off, and people who had never forgotten it. "You know," Michael said, "all these years after, everything you still scare me more than anyone." Eleanor looked at him. She said, "You should be slightly scared of people who are smarter than you. This keeps you careful." Michael laughed, that gravel sound. Eleanor felt it again, the warmth that lived next to the grief. Mrs. laugh and Michael's laugh occupying the same frequency, a register, a sound that connected the life she'd had to the life she was still building. "If you call," Michael said. The simple sentence that had been true for 40 years and showed no sign of change. "Oh," Eleanor said, "I'm hoping I won't need to." Either way, she agreed. Out his hand. She shook it. Then, because some moments are larger than a handshake, she stepped around the counter and hugged him once, briefly, with the particular efficiency of a person who expresses affection precisely rather than abundantly. He walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the frame and looked back at her one last time. "Mother was right about you," he said. Every single thing he ever said. Eleanor looked at the window. At the morning light of Silver Creek in early spring, a particular quality of light that arrives after a long Montana winter and carries in it the complete, uncomplicated promise that the cold is not permanent, that things grow back, that what was stripped down can return. "But he usually was," she said. Michael walked out the door. There, she listened to the engines start, not 347 this time, 30-some, and the sound was different at this scale. The wall of sound that had shaken the windows in October, something more personal, a sound that had names attached to it, almost parsed by individual engine, by rider, by the specific human being behind each throttle. She listened until it faded. Then she picked up her tool and went back to work. On the last Sunday of April, Cedar Creek held the annual spring gathering that had been a community tradition for decades and that had, like many things in the 2 years of Grant Holloway's presence, contracted and quieted and lost something of its original weight. Like this year it came back fully. Charlie Briggs opened the Golden Eagle early and kept it open all day. Donna brought produce from his land, in his hands for 6 weeks now, already producing, and set it up on a table outside the door with a handwritten sign that said simply, "From the Donnelly Farm." Back. The Calloway brothers drove in from the lumber yard with 3 of their employees, all of whom still had jobs because the yard had reopened the previous Monday. Harmon sat in the sun outside the Golden Eagle for most of the afternoon, talking to whoever sat down next to him, telling stories about Silver Creek that went back 4 generations, the ones he'd promised Derek he would tell, are now spreading wider, given to anyone who wanted them. Because Bill had decided in October that the stories that aren't passed on are the first things a community loses. A lot of stories left. Eleanor came at noon and stayed until 3. She moved through the gathering the way she moved through everything without announcement, occupying the center, present and connected, and quietly attentive to everyone she spoke to. People stopped her constantly, people she knew well and people she barely knew, to talk, to say something, to acknowledge what had happened without quite knowing how to do it. A woman named Helen, who had lived 3 streets over from the shop for 11 years, and who Eleanor knew primarily by sight, met her near the cafe door and said, somewhat breathlessly, Eleanor, I just want to say, I watched everything that happened, and I didn't do anything. I should have. I was scared, and I told myself it wasn't my business, and Eleanor stopped her gently. Helen, are you planning to do something different next time? Helen blinked. Absolutely. Yes. Then that's what matters, Eleanor said. Helen looked at her like she'd been given something she'd been trying to figure out how to ask for. It, she said. Just that's it? Accountability isn't punishment, Eleanor said. Deciding what you do next. She paused. We all have a next time. Helen, use yours well. She moved on. Helen stood and watched her go with the expression of someone who has just received advice they're going to carry for the rest of their life. Late that afternoon, Eleanor walked back to the shop alone. She unlocked the door and went in and stood in the quiet of it. Particular quiet of a space that has held many things, years of work, years of marriage, 9 years of solitary continuation, 7 months of meticulous and patient resistance, and now on the other side of all of it, the particular piece of a situation that has been seen through to its right conclusion. She looked at the work table, at the tools, at the walls that Thomas's hands had touched. Paragraph she'd returned to its place on the shop wall. The kitchen had been right for the winter, but the shop was where he belonged, where they had both belonged, where she still belonged. She sat down in his chair. She opened the notebook to the last page of entries. She read the final entry from the day of the federal investigator's visit, and then she turned to a fresh page. She picked up the pen. She sat with it for a moment. Then she wrote, clear, unornamented handwriting. The land is back. The yard is back. The town is back. The case is moving. The network is building. Thomas, we're okay. Closed the notebook. She put the pen down. She sat in the quiet of the shop for a while, with the afternoon light coming through the window and the wind chimes barely audible from outside. And she felt completely, without reservation, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was supposed to be doing, which was the most profound thing a person can feel and one of the rarest. Plus, she had been 72 years old when Grant Holloway walked through her door and looked at her and saw no one worth taking seriously. She was 73 now. The world still mostly saw an old woman with silver blonde hair and a faded leather jacket and quiet voice who fixed things in a shop on the edge of Route 12 in a small Montana mountain town. The world didn't see what it had never seen. What had underestimated every single time was a woman who had spent an entire lifetime understanding that real power is not taken. It is built, one person at a time, in hospital waiting rooms and kitchen tables and late evenings with notebooks and phone calls made and kept and honored across decades. It is built by showing up when you don't have to, by staying when everyone expects you to leave, by keeping your word when there is no witness and no reward, by being the kind of person that 347 people will drive 2 days to stand beside, by being the kind of woman that even the most powerful men in the room call boss. Eleanor Whitmore had never asked to be that. She had simply refused quietly, completely, and without exception to be anything less.